Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. A park ranger in northern Minnesota for over a decade, I've always felt at home in the vast wilderness. But recently a series of strange events has shaken my sense of peace and left me questioning the very nature of the woods I thought I knew. It started with odd animal behavior. A hiker, Jim Larson, stumbled into the ranger station, pale and trembling, describing a creature he'd seen on the North Shore Trail: clawed feet, a long neck, and eyes that shone like a cat's. He claimed it followed him, but vanished when he tried to take a picture. I dismissed it as fatigue or nerves, but then more reports came in. A farmer saw a tall, dark figure moving through his fields at night, and hunters found strange tracks near the lake, too large and misshapen for any known animal. Then came the first body. Ellie Harper, a college student hiking alone, was found mangled beyond recognition just off the Pine Ridge Trail. The medical examiner called it an animal attack, but the wounds were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Deep slashes, her face almost unrecognizable. It wasn't natural. This wasn't the work of any predator I knew. After that, the reports escalated: missing campers, more sightings. People described creatures that were more than just animals. Tall beings with bark-like skin and eyes that gleamed with unnatural intelligence. One hunter, Dean Walker, even described a creature with a twisted, almost human face. I knew we were dealing with something beyond comprehension. The day after Ellie's body was discovered, I set out to retrace her steps, hoping for some clue. The forest was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Deep in the woods, I found a patch of disturbed earth, too precise to be the work of an animal. Then I saw them: tracks, not animal tracks, but something larger, with clawed toes, as if the creature walked upright, but with an unnatural gait. As I stood there, heart pounding, a low growl echoed through the trees. It wasn't the growl of any wolf or bear I'd ever heard. It was deeper, resonating in my chest like it came from the earth itself. I reached for my radio, but before I could speak, the growl stopped. I was being watched. Slowly I backed away, but a snap of a twig behind me made me whirl around. There it stood, just feet away, tall, over 7 feet, with long, unnatural limbs and mottled gray-brown skin like bark. Its eyes were the same eerie, reflective ones the hunters had described. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and the growl that sent shivers down my spine came from deep within its throat. I was paralyzed, not just by its size or appearance, but by its presence. It exuded a dark energy that made the air thick and oppressive. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then, as if toying with me, it reached out with one long, clawed hand and gently touched my cheek. A shock of coldness surged through me, the skin where it touched burning with an unnatural chill. My vision blurred, and then, just as quickly, it was gone. I stumbled back to the ranger station, my mind reeling. I couldn't make sense of what had happened. Why had it let me go? When I arrived, my supervisor, Jim, was waiting with a grim expression. He showed me photos of grotesquely mangled animal carcasses: wolves, deer, even a moose. The wounds were clean, almost surgical, and the animal's eyes were frozen open in terror. "They're saying it's something new," Jim said, his voice shaking, "something unnatural." The Department of Natural Resources was starting to believe it was a new species, something that had been hiding in the woods, adapting, and now revealing itself. The thought terrified me. Our ecosystem was delicate, and this creature was disrupting the balance. The next day, I joined a search team, locals, hunters, and DNR officers. We were armed, but I wasn't sure it would be enough. We found another deer carcass, torn apart like the others, and a trail of humanoid tracks leading towards a ridge with a series of caves. As we followed the tracks, the air grew colder, and a sense of dread washed over me. We were walking into the creature's lair. The first shot rang out, followed by more, but the creature was too fast. It darted between the trees, a blur in the dim light. Then it was gone. A new sound emerged, something heavy being dragged through the forest. The creature reappeared, dragging a lifeless body behind it, another victim. It was collecting them, building something. "Get back!" Jim shouted, panic in his voice. We were trapped. The creature was too powerful. I glanced at the others, their faces etched with fear. We couldn't let it win, but how could we fight it? "The caves!" I yelled. "We have to get to the caves." We ran, the creature's lair pulling us in. Inside, the stench of decay was overwhelming. The walls were slick with moisture, and in the flickering light of our flashlights, we saw them human remains, twisted and distorted, lining the walls, and in the center, a massive unfinished painting depicting the creature and its faceless victims. It wasn't just hunting, it was creating, and we were next. "We have to stop it," I whispered, fear and determination battling within me, "before it's too late." But deep down I knew it might already be too late. The creature was taking everything, and we were running out of time. Okay, so picture this. It's 1988, and I'm freezing my butt off in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. I just got dropped off at this remote fire tower, and the snowmobile that brought me here is kicking up a blizzard as it speeds away. I'm all alone. This grizzled old guy named Vic was driving the snowmobile. Before he took off, he gave me this look, like he was trying to warn me about something. "You'll be fine," he muttered, his voice muffled by his scarf. "Just remember the rules. Frank's always on the radio if you need him." I nodded, trying to look tough, but honestly, I was freaking out a little. This wasn't just a job for me, it was an escape. I needed to get away from everything, and the Alaskan wilderness seemed like the perfect place to disappear. The fire tower was this rickety old thing, made of wood and probably held together with duct tape and prayers. It looked way older than I expected. A set of stairs spiraled up to a tiny cabin at the top. I took a deep breath, adjusted my backpack, and started trudging through the snow. "One last thing," Vic yelled after me. "Don't mess with the floodlight unless you have to." I turned back, frowning. "Why?" He just shrugged, like it wasn't worth explaining. "You'll know if you need it." And with that, he took off, leaving me standing there in the snow, feeling like I'd just been dropped on another planet. Inside the tower, the air was stale and cold. There was this weird metallic smell, like something had burned in there a long time ago. The cabin was small, but it had everything I needed: a bunk bed, a wood stove, a desk with some old maps, and a radio. The radio crackled to life as soon as I dropped my bag. "Is this the new guy?" a voice asked. It was rough but friendly. "Yeah, just got here," I said into the handset. "You must be Frank." "That's right," he said. "Welcome to paradise." He chuckled. "First things first, settle in. But read the manual, follow the rules, and you'll be fine." "Anything specific I should know?" I asked. There was a pause. Then he said, "A few things. Don't leave the tower after dark, no matter what you hear. Don't shine the floodlight unless it's an emergency. And if the radio goes dead, stay put until morning." His tone made it clear he wasn't kidding. "Got it," I said. The line went dead, and I put the handset back on its cradle. My eyes wandered to the desk, where a thick manual sat beneath a stack of papers. On top of the pile was a leather-bound journal. Curious, I opened it up. The handwriting was messy, like the writer had been in a hurry. March 3rd. First day at the tower. Quiet so far, too quiet. The forest stretches on forever, a sea of black pines against the snow. It feels alive somehow, like it's watching me. I'm probably just tired or imagining things. The entry ended abruptly. I flipped through the pages, skimming the fragmented thoughts. The writer, someone named Eddie, had worked in this tower years ago. His early entries were pretty normal: observations about the weather, complaints about the boredom. But as I got to the later entries, his tone changed. March 12th. The wind doesn't sound right. It's not just wind, it's voices. I tried the floodlight, but it didn't help, just made things worse. I snapped the journal shut, a shiver running down my spine. I looked out the window at the swirling snow and the dark forest. I tried to tell myself it was just a story, a guy going crazy from isolation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, the wind howled around the tower, shaking the walls and rattling the windows. I lay on the bunk, staring at the ceiling, the journal's words echoing in my mind. Then I heard it, a faint knocking sound, cutting through the noise of the wind. I sat up, my heart pounding. It was rhythmic, deliberate, not the random creaks of the tower settling. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the window. The forest was still blanketed in snow, but the knocking continued. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the supports beneath the tower. "Just the wind," I whispered to myself, but the words sounded hollow. I wanted to believe it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. The knocking stopped suddenly, leaving an oppressive silence. I stood there, straining to hear anything else, but there was nothing. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I tried to shake off the creepy feeling from the night before and focus on my job. I scanned the horizon with the binoculars, looking for any sign of smoke or trouble. The landscape was beautiful, but it was also desolate and lonely. By noon, the radio crackled to life. "How's it going up there?" Frank's voice boomed through the speaker. "Quiet," I replied. "No smoke, no issues." "That's good," he said. "Keep your eyes open. This time of year, things can change fast." Before I could respond, the radio emitted a burst of static, followed by a faint voice, too muffled to understand. I tried adjusting the dial, but the line went dead. "Frank?" I said into the handset. "Nothing, just static." I frowned. Maybe the storm the night before had messed with the signal. Or maybe it was just old equipment acting up. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced at the journal on the desk, its leather cover practically daring me to open it again. But I resisted. Instead, I picked up the binoculars and resumed my watch. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was far away, little more than a shadow among the trees. But it was definitely human. My pulse quickened as I adjusted the focus, trying to get a clearer view. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I lowered the binoculars, my hands trembling. Who was that, and why were they standing so close to the tower? I didn't have any answers, but as the daylight faded and the shadows grew longer, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. That night, the knocking returned, louder this time and more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the same spot beneath the tower, but now it was accompanied by a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging against wood. I gripped the flashlight, my knuckles white, and peered out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, but the sounds didn't stop. Knock, knock, scrape. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. The radio was dead again. Vic's warning echoed in my mind. Don't mess with the floodlight unless you have to. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the switch. Was this an emergency? Did I need it? The knocking grew louder, more frantic. With a deep breath, I flipped the switch. The floodlight roared to life, bathing the clearing in a harsh white glow. For a moment, the forest seemed to recoil, its shadows retreating, and then I saw it. Standing just beyond the edge of the light was the figure from before. It was closer now, its features still obscured, but its presence undeniable. It didn't move. It just stared. The floodlight flickered, and my blood ran cold. When it steadied, the figure was gone. I turned off the light and locked the door, my hands shaking. Sleep was out of the question. All I could do was wait for dawn and hope I'd make it through the night. As the first light of morning crept over the horizon, I sat slumped in the chair by the desk, exhausted but alive. The journal stared back at me, its leather cover gleaming faintly in the pale light. I opened it again, flipping to a page I hadn't read before. The words seemed to leap off the page, scrawled in frantic, uneven strokes. If you see it, don't look away. If it knocks, don't answer. It wants you to break the rules. I closed the journal with a snap, my heart pounding. Whatever I'd signed up for, it was far more than just a job. And it wasn't going to let me leave. The snow around the fire tower sparkled under the weak morning sun, a deceptively calm scene that felt worlds away from the night's events. My body ached from the tension of staying awake, and my mind raced with unanswered questions. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure I'd seen, the way it stood at the edge of the light, unmoving yet undeniably aware of me. I busied myself with routine tasks to push the memory aside. I scanned the forest with the binoculars, panning slowly across the endless sea of pines. Nothing unusual, no smoke, no movement, but the eerie stillness felt like a warning. The radio crackled suddenly, and I jumped. "Morning." Frank's voice greeted me, calm and familiar. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. "Everything's quiet. No smoke." "That's good," Frank said, then hesitated. "How was last night?" I paused, debating whether to tell him about the knocking, the scraping, the figure. But I remembered his earlier instructions. Follow the rules and don't ask too many questions. "It was fine," I lied. Frank didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was clipped. "Good. Keep your head on straight out there. This job has a way of messing with people." The line went dead before I could reply. By mid-afternoon, a faint column of smoke appeared on the horizon, a dark thread against the pale blue sky. My heart sank. It wasn't supposed to happen this early in the season. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button. "Frank, do you copy? There's smoke southeast of my position, maybe 5 miles out." Static hissed, followed by a faint, fragmented sound that didn't resemble Frank's voice. I adjusted the dial, but the line stayed dead. "Frank, are you there?" Nothing. I stared at the smoke, unsure of what to do. The manual was clear about staying close to the tower, but the situation didn't feel like something I could ignore. If there was a fire, it could spread quickly, and I couldn't count on Frank to help. Grabbing my backpack, I stuffed it with essentials: water, a flashlight, a flare gun. I slipped the journal into a side pocket, almost as an afterthought. The thick leather made me feel slightly more grounded, as absurd as that seemed. Finally, I grabbed the rifle mounted on the wall. It was old and heavy, but the ammunition was intact. I didn't know what I was expecting to encounter, but after last night I wasn't taking any chances. I descended the tower, the stairs creaking under my boots, and set off toward the smoke. The forest was silent as I moved through it, the snow crunching softly beneath my feet. The air was sharp and cold, biting at my face and filling my lungs with every breath. As I walked, the smoke grew closer, thicker, until the acrid smell of burning wood reached my nose. I found the source about an hour later, a campsite, or rather, what was left of one. The fire had been small and contained, but it had burned down to ashes. Around it were signs of a hasty departure: an overturned kettle, a torn sleeping bag, a scattering of belongings half buried in the snow. I crouched down, inspecting the scene. Something felt off. There were no footprints leading away from the site, no signs of anyone leaving, just the eerie suggestion that whoever had been here had vanished into thin air. Among the scattered items, something caught my eye: a blood-stained map. The paper was yellowed and brittle, as though it had been exposed to the elements for far too long. An X was scrawled on it in red ink, marking a spot deeper in the forest. My fingers hesitated before picking it up. The sight of the blood made my stomach churn, but my curiosity outweighed my fear. I folded the map carefully and slid it into my pocket. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying a faint, hollow sound that I couldn't quite place. A chill ran down my spine. I stood scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just the endless pines swaying gently in the breeze. I decided to head back to the tower. Whatever I'd stumbled upon, it wasn't something I wanted to deal with out here. The feeling of being watched clung to me all the way back. Night fell quickly, as it always did in the wilderness. and I returned to the relative safety of the tower. I locked the hatch behind me and double-checked the floodlight switch, making sure everything was in order. The rifle was propped against the wall beside the desk, within easy reach. As I sat down, the journal called to me, its leather cover glinting faintly in the lamplight. I flipped to a random page, my heart heavy with apprehension. March 15th. I saw it again, just standing there watching. I think it wants me to leave, but it doesn't seem angry. Not yet. If I break the rules, though, I don't think it will let me go. The words sent a shiver through me. Was Eddie writing about the same figure I'd seen? The same one that had been just beyond the floodlight's reach? A loud knock jolted me from my thoughts. Knock, knock, knock. It was louder than before, echoing through the structure with a deliberate rhythm. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the flashlight. This time, the sound wasn't coming from beneath the tower. It was coming from the stairs. I stood, every muscle in my body tense, and moved toward the window. The flashlight's beam swept over the steps, illuminating nothing but the empty wood. The knocking stopped abruptly. Then, faintly, I heard it, a low scraping sound, like nails dragging along the outer wall of the cabin. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned toward the floodlight switch, but a sudden surge of static from the radio made me freeze. The noise was sharp, grating, and it quickly gave way to something worse. A voice. It wasn't Frank's. It was distorted, guttural, and wrong. You're not alone. The words were faint but unmistakable. My hand hovered over the radio, unsure whether to respond. The static returned, louder now, until the speaker emitted a sharp crack and went silent. I stared at the radio, my mind racing. The knock, the scrape, the voice. It was all connected somehow, but I didn't know how to make sense of it. A sudden thud against the wall snapped me out of my thoughts. This wasn't random. It was testing me, trying to make me break the rules. I had to hold firm. I turned off the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only light came from the moon, casting pale beams through the windows. I sat in the corner, clutching the rifle, and waited. The knocking didn't come again that night, but the silence that replaced it felt worse. The next morning, I unfolded the blood-stained map on the desk. The red X stared back at me, daring me to find it. I didn't know why Eddie's journal hadn't mentioned a map or a campsite, but the connection felt undeniable. It's a language. The rest of the day passed in a haze of paranoia. Every sound outside the tower felt amplified. The groan of the wind, the creak of the wood, the distant snap of a branch. I busied myself scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of movement, but the binoculars revealed only an endless expanse of white and green. I grabbed the journal again, flipping through the pages in search of answers. One line stood out, written in shaky handwriting near the end. March 18th. It's drawing me closer. I think it wants me to find something, or maybe it's leading me to my end. My hand trembled as I set the journal down. The X loomed large in my mind, a mystery I couldn't ignore. But the rules were clear: stay in the tower after dark. And yet, part of me wondered if that was exactly what it wanted. The journal felt heavier in my hands as I opened it again, the faint smell of aged paper mingling with the cold air in the cabin. My eyes scanned the jagged handwriting of Eddie, the previous fire watcher. It was the only thing tethering me to some semblance of understanding, or at least I hoped it would be. March 20th. I know it's watching me. Every time I turn away, I can feel it there waiting. It doesn't just want me gone. It wants me to see something, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to look. The words sank in, gnawing at my thoughts. Eddie had walked these same steps, climbed these stairs, and stared out into the same forest. And yet, he hadn't made it out. What was it that he couldn't face? I flipped ahead, the pages filled with hurried, fragmented entries, each one more erratic than the last. March 22nd. It's not the forest that's alive. It's the space between the trees. It moves when I blink, when I sleep, when I think I'm safe. March 23rd. The knocking isn't random. It's a language. I tried to knock back, and now it's louder, closer. Don't answer. Don't respond. Don't look. I shut the journal abruptly, my pulse quickening. A deep unease settled over me, like the weight of the air had shifted. Outside, the snow fell softly, coating the forest in a deceptive stillness. But Eddie's words lingered, sharp and insistent. By late afternoon, the radio crackled to life. Frank. I grabbed the handset, my voice shaky with relief. His tone was clipped. You've been quiet. I saw smoke yesterday, I said, hesitating, and I found something. A campsite, but no footprints. And this. I unfolded the blood-stained map, as if he could see it through the static. There's a marked spot deeper in the forest. Frank was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. Don't go near it. Why not? I demanded. What is it? You're there to watch, not to wander. Stay in the tower, keep your eyes open, and follow the rules. That's how you make it through. The line went dead before I could argue. Frustration boiled over, and I slammed the handset onto the desk. Frank's cryptic warnings weren't enough anymore. I needed answers. That night, the knocking returned. It started faintly, a soft rhythm on the stairs. Knock, knock, knock. Each impact reverberated through the wooden frame of the tower, deliberate and insistent. My heart pounded as I reached for the flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing. The sound grew louder, more forceful. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it wasn't just on the stairs. It was on the walls, the windows, the very structure of the cabin. It was everywhere, surrounding me. I backed into the corner, gripping the rifle tightly, and shouted into the empty air, "What do you want?" The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. I strained to hear anything, any movement, any whisper, but the only sound was my own ragged breathing. And then, faintly, a new sound emerged, a low, guttural hum, like a chant carried on the wind. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the radio. I stared at the handset, my fingers trembling as I reached for it. Static buzzed faintly, interspersed with unintelligible words. A voice, not Frank's. "Bring it back," the distorted voice whispered. I dropped the handset, the sound continuing even as it hit the floor. My eyes darted to the map on the desk, the red X glaring back at me like a challenge. The next morning I made a decision. I couldn't sit here and let this thing, whatever it was, toy with me. If the map was a clue, I needed to follow it. Eddie's journal might have been his warning, but it was also my guide. and right now, it was the only thing making any sense. I packed quickly, taking the rifle, the flashlight, and the map. The journal came with me too, its weight a small comfort. Before I left, I turned on the floodlight, its powerful beam cutting through the morning fog. A beacon, in case I needed to find my way back. The forest was colder than usual, the air biting at my face as I trudged through the snow. The map led me southeast, deeper into the trees. The further I went, the quieter it became. The snow muffled my footsteps, and the wind barely rustled the branches above. After an hour, I noticed something strange. The trees around me bore markings, deep gouges carved into the bark, forming crude, jagged shapes. They didn't look like natural damage. They looked deliberate, like someone or something had left them as a trail. The path led me to a clearing. At its center stood a stone circle, the gray rocks weathered and covered in moss. Symbols were etched into their surfaces, similar to the ones on the trees. In the middle of the circle was a pit, its edges uneven and crumbling. The air around it felt charged, like the static before a storm. I stepped closer, my breath visible in the frigid air. The pit seemed impossibly deep, its darkness swallowing the weak light of my flashlight. A faint hum emanated from within, the same sound I'd heard on the radio. As I stared into the void, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the figure, closer now. Its features were still obscured, its body a shadow against the snow, but its eyes, two pinpricks of pale, flickering light, locked onto mine. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, a pressure that pushed against every fiber of my being. The hum from the pit grew louder, resonating in my skull. I stumbled backward, trying to put distance between myself and the figure, but it didn't follow. It simply stood there, watching. And then, without warning, it raised a hand and pointed, not at me, but at the journal in my pack. The realization hit me like a bolt of ice. This wasn't about the map, or the tower, or even the forest. It was about the journal. I turned and ran. I sprinted through the trees, the figure's gesture burned into my mind. It didn't want me, it wanted the journal. But why? I burst back into the clearing surrounding the tower, the floodlight a beacon in the swirling snow. I scrambled up the stairs, my lungs burning, and slammed the hatch shut behind me. The journal lay on the desk, seemingly innocuous, but I knew it held the key to this nightmare. Eddie's words echoed in my mind. Don't let it leave the tower. But why? What was so important about this journal? I frantically flipped through the pages, searching for answers. March 24th. The pit wasn't natural. Something carved it. Something old. The symbols. The humming. They pull at you. The map was my warning. If you see the X, don't go. Don't let it know you've seen the X. The pit. The map. It wasn't just a clue. It was a test. And I had failed. The rest of the day was a blur of restless anxiety. I tried to distract myself with routine checks, but the forest offered no answers. The radio remained silent, even as I desperately tried to reach Frank. His absence was unnerving. As the sun set, I secured the tower, the rifle within reach. The knocking started again, louder than ever. Knock, knock, knock. It reverberated through the tower, and I gripped the rifle, my heart pounding. The knocking stopped, and a heavy silence fell. Then, from the radio, came the sound I dreaded most, static. "Frank?" I said, my voice trembling. "Are you there?" The static crackled, and a voice emerged. "Not Frank's. Bring it back." The distorted voice growled. I stumbled back from the radio, my eyes drawn to the journal on the desk. My gut screamed that it was connected to everything, the pit, the figure, the voices. But how? I opened it, flipping through the pages. Eddie's handwriting was frantic, his words barely legible, but one entry caught my eye. March 27th. The forest doesn't want us here. The journal isn't just a record, it's a tether to what, I don't know. But I can't let it go. If it leaves, so do I. A tether. Was the journal holding me here? Or was it holding something else back? The knocking resumed, faster and more violent, like fists pounding on the walls. Then came the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, ascending the stairs. My chest tightened as I aimed the rifle at the hatch. The footsteps stopped just outside. Then came the voice again, not from the radio this time, but from directly above me, vibrating through the wood. "It's not yours to keep." The hatch creaked, the hinges straining under pressure. I held my breath, ready to fire. The journal seemed to pulse on the desk, its presence overwhelming. My instinct screamed at me to throw it out, to rid myself of the cursed thing. But Eddie's words echoed in my mind. "If it leaves, so do I." The hatch rattled but didn't open. Instead, the voice shifted, softer now, almost coaxing. "You don't belong here. Let it go." I stood frozen, torn between two choices. If I kept the journal, the figure would never stop coming. If I let it go, I might survive. But at what cost? The hatch fell silent, but the tension remained. My gaze shifted to the journal. I flipped through the pages again, searching for a clue, and found one final entry. March 28th. I made my choice. I threw it into the pit. It didn't save me, it only made it stronger. Eddie had tried to escape by giving it what it wanted, and he had failed. I stepped away from the desk, my thoughts racing. If the journal was a tether, then destroying it wasn't enough. It needed to be severed. But how? The wind howled outside, rattling the tower. The floodlight flickered, and the shadows seemed to dance. My hands trembled as I picked up the journal, its weight somehow heavier than before. Then it hit me. The pit. The journal had come from there, or at least it was tied to it. If I could destroy it there, maybe I could return it to where it belonged. But doing so would mean venturing into the clearing again, facing whatever waited there. The thought sent a wave of fear through me, but I knew I didn't have a choice. The trek to the pit was agonizing. The snow seemed thicker, the forest darker, as if the trees themselves were closing in. The journal pulsed in my pack, an almost living thing, its presence a constant weight on my mind. When I reached the clearing, the pit loomed before me, its edges glowing faintly with the strange symbols carved into the stone. The humming was louder now, resonating in my bones. And there it was, the figure. It stood on the far side of the pit, its pale eyes locked onto mine. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. I stepped closer to the pit, the journal clutched in my hands. The humming intensified, the air vibrating with energy. The figure tilted its head, watching as I approached. "Return it," the voice whispered. Yet it filled the clearing. I hesitated. Eddie's warning echoed in my mind. It didn't save me, it only made it stronger. But if keeping the journal meant staying trapped in this nightmare, then what choice did I have? I took another step toward the pit, the journal trembling in my hands. The figure remained still, its gaze unwavering. Then, with all the strength I could muster, I hurled the journal into the darkness. The moment it vanished into the pit, the humming stopped. The forest fell silent. The air was still. The figure tilted its head again, then began to dissolve, its form breaking apart like smoke in the wind. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The pit began to glow, a deep, pulsing red light emanating from its depths. The ground shook beneath my feet, and a sound unlike anything I had ever heard erupted from the void, a scream guttural and primal, filled with rage and triumph. The trees around the clearing began to sway, their trunks groaning as if alive. The symbols on the stones pulsed, their glow intensifying. The pit wasn't closing, it was opening. I turned and ran, my heart pounding as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The trees moved, their branches clawing at me, the snow shifting under my feet. The scream followed me, growing louder, more deafening with each step. When I reached the tower, I slammed the hatch shut and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The radio crackled to life, and Frank's voice came through, urgent and panicked. "What did you do?" "I threw it in," I stammered. A long pause, then, in a voice filled with dread, Frank said, "You've made it worse." The days that followed were a blur. The forest never went silent again. The knocking stopped, but the hum persisted, faint yet constant, a reminder of the choice I had made. When the snowmobile arrived to pick me up, Vic didn't say a word. He glanced at the tower, then at me, his expression grim. I climbed into the sled without looking back. As we sped away, I felt a strange weight in my bag. My heart sank as I opened it and found the journal. Its leather cover was pristine, its pages blank. The pit had returned it, and now it was mine. Okay, so I wasn't exactly thrilled about this whole thing. When Luke suggested a weekend trip to some secluded lake, I thought it sounded more like a punishment than a vacation. But Luke has this way of getting you to agree to his plans, like you don't even realize what you're getting into until it's too late. Jess, his girlfriend, was already on board, and Ryan, who's always looking for an excuse to skip work, was in too. That left me and Maddie, the newbies in the group, to round out the numbers. Whispering Waters, Luke said, dragging out the name like it was some spooky campfire story. Even the name sounded like it belonged in one of those cheesy horror movies we used to watch in college. He swore the place was amazing. Crystal clear water, surrounded by forests, and a cabin that was close enough to civilization if we needed anything, but far enough away to feel like we were escaping. He conveniently forgot to mention the legend until we were already halfway there. Whispering Waters, he said again, doing his best ghost story voice. They say it remembers everyone who visits. What's that supposed to mean? Ryan asked from the back seat, sounding amused. Just a local legend, Luke said with a shrug. But he was totally enjoying freaking us out. Apparently people who come to the lake never really leave. Like it takes a part of you or something stays behind. Jess, who was in the passenger seat, turned around to face us. Okay, that's creepy. Where did you hear that? Luke waved it off. Some article online, probably just trying to scare tourists. Maddie, who had been quiet most of the drive, finally spoke up. Legends like that don't come from nowhere. The car got really quiet after she said that. Ryan laughed to break the tension. Relax, Maddie. It's a lake, not a cursed artifact. But her words stuck with me. Legends don't come from nowhere. The turnoff to the cabin was easy to miss. Just a narrow dirt road with a bunch of tall pine trees on either side. The car bounced and rattled as Luke drove down the bumpy path, and by the time we finally reached the cabin, I felt like my insides had been scrambled. The cabin itself was, well, rustic. Peeling paint, a porch that looked like it was about to collapse, and this musty smell that hit us the second we opened the door. It's got character, Luke said, clapping me on the back. Yeah, if that character is tetanus, I muttered under my breath. The inside was a little better, but not much. The furniture looked like it came from a thrift store, and the kitchen appliances seemed like they were about to explode, but it was livable, I guess. We each picked a room, dumped our bags, and agreed to meet back in the living room after unpacking. When I got downstairs, Jess was looking at a book she'd found on the coffee table. Guys, look at this. It wasn't really a book, more like a journal. The cover was all cracked and worn, and the pages were filled with crazy handwriting. What really freaked us out were these phrases written over and over, like the person who wrote it was losing their mind. It knows us now. Don't listen to it. Someone's idea of a joke, Ryan said, looking over her shoulder. Probably left here to scare people. Well, it's working, Jess muttered, closing the journal and putting it back on the table. That evening, we built a fire in the fire pit outside and roasted marshmallows like we were kids again. Ryan told this ridiculous story about a haunted amusement park, complete with sound effects and everything, that had Jess and Maddie cracking up. Even I started to relax a little. The air was cool, the fire was warm, and for a minute, I thought maybe this trip wouldn't be so bad after all. Then the whispers started. At first I thought it was just the wind, a faint rustling in the trees and around the lake. But as it got later, it got more distinct, soft, almost impossible to hear. Voices carrying words I couldn't quite make out. I looked at the others, wondering if they heard it too, but nobody said anything. Maybe I was just imagining things. When the fire died down, we headed inside. I hung back for a second, looking out at the lake. It was so still, like a sheet of glass, reflecting the moon and stars. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the middle of the lake. But when I blinked, it was gone. Hey, you coming? Luke called from the doorway. I shook off the uneasy feeling and went inside. I barely slept that night. The cabin was too quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear every little creak and groan of the old wood. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps outside, soft and slow. I sat up in bed, listening hard, but the sound was gone. The next morning, everyone else seemed fine, like they hadn't heard anything. Luke made coffee, Ryan cooked up some questionable breakfast, and Jess and Maddie complained about the lack of cell service. I was the only one who couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After breakfast, we decided to explore the lake. Luke and Ryan grabbed the kayak that was stored under the cabin, while Jess and Maddie decided to walk along the shore. I went with them, my boots crunching on the damp ground. The lake was beautiful in the daylight, the water so clear you could see straight down to the bottom. But there was something about it that felt unnatural, too perfect, like it was trying too hard to be inviting. Halfway around the lake, Jess suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" We all froze. The only sound was the water lapping against the shore. "Hear what?" Luke asked. Jess hesitated. "It sounded like, I don't know, like someone whispering." Ryan groaned. "Okay, enough with the ghost stories. You're going to give yourself a panic attack." But Jess didn't look any less freaked out. "I'm serious. It sounded like my name." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "It was probably just the wind," I said, even though I wasn't so sure myself. We kept walking, but the mood had changed. Even Luke, who's usually so upbeat, seemed quieter than usual. When we got back to the cabin, Jess sat on the porch, staring out at the lake. "It's watching us," she said softly. "What is?" I asked, sitting next to her. She didn't answer. That night, the whispers came back, louder and more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the lake, swirling around the cabin like a thick fog. This time I knew I wasn't the only one who heard them. Ryan shot up from the couch, his face pale. "Who's doing that?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No one's doing anything," Luke snapped. "It's just—" "Don't," Maddie interrupted. Her voice was calm but firm. "Don't explain it away. We all hear it." For once, Luke didn't argue. We sat in silence, listening to the whispers get louder, the words still just out of reach. It felt like they were closing in on us, waiting for something. Eventually, the whispers faded, leaving only the sound of the wind. None of us slept that night. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, I realized something. The lake wasn't just a backdrop to our weekend getaway. It was alive, and it wanted something from us. The morning felt heavy, maybe from the lack of sleep, but the air itself seemed thick and oppressive. Outside, the lake was unnervingly still, reflecting the overcast sky like a mirror. Maddie was the first to speak as we gathered in the kitchen. "Did anyone actually sleep?" she asked, her voice strained. "Nope," Ryan said, rubbing his eyes. "Whoever was whispering all night, thanks for that. Real funny." "No one was whispering, Ryan," Jess snapped. She looked exhausted, her usual calmness replaced by a nervous energy. "We all heard it." Luke poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements stiff. "It's the wind," he said flatly. "We're in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and water. The acoustics probably make it sound weird." Maddie gave him a look. "You don't really believe that?" He didn't answer, just sipped his coffee and stared out the window. We spent the morning exploring the cabin, partly out of boredom and partly to distract ourselves. The journal Jess had found was still on the coffee table, its cracked cover practically daring someone to open it. I tried to ignore it, but eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I opened it again, flipping past the repeated phrases we'd seen before. Deeper in the journal, the handwriting got even crazier, like the writer had been in a hurry or maybe their hand was shaking. One entry stood out: "They only come when it's quiet." Don't let it get too quiet. The noise keeps them at bay. Guys, you might want to see this, I said, holding up the journal. Luke glanced over my shoulder. More ramblings from some crazy old hermit. This isn't just rambling, I said, pointing to the entry. They're talking about keeping noise going, like it's a defense or something. Jess frowned. What does they mean, the whispers? I don't know, I admitted. But whoever wrote this was scared out of their mind. Ryan snorted. Yeah, or they were drunk or high, or both. Either way, it's not exactly a reliable source. Maddie's voice cut through the room. What if it's true? Her words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. No one laughed, no one dismissed her, because deep down, none of us could shake the feeling that she might be right. In the afternoon, we decided to split up and explore the area around the lake. Luke and Ryan took the kayaks again, while Jess, Maddie, and I walked in the opposite direction from the day before. The air was colder, the wind sharper, and the snow crunching under our boots was the only sound. It was oddly comforting, that crunching noise. It broke up the stillness that had been bothering me since we arrived. Maddie walked ahead, her eyes scanning the trees like she was searching for something. Jess stayed close to me, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Do you think Luke's right? She asked quietly. About the wind? I hesitated. I don't know, maybe. You don't believe that, she said, glancing at me. It wasn't a question. No, I admitted. But I don't know what to believe. Jess nodded, her gaze drifting to the lake. It feels like it's watching us. I didn't have a response to that. I'd been thinking the same thing, but I didn't want to say it out loud. About half a mile from the cabin, Maddie stopped abruptly. She knelt down, brushing snow away from the ground. What is it? I asked, stepping closer. She didn't answer right away, her hands moving quickly as she uncovered something buried in the snow. Finally, she straightened up, holding a rusted tin box. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, and the lid was sealed shut with what looked like years of ice and grime. Jess frowned. What's that doing out here? Maddie shook her head. I don't know. But it doesn't belong here. She tried to open it, but the lid wouldn't budge. Let's take it back to the cabin, she said. We can figure it out there. I didn't argue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside that box, we weren't meant to find it. Back at the cabin, we used a kitchen knife to pry the lid open. The smell hit us first, a musty, metallic scent that made me gag. Inside were old photographs, faded and warped from time. They showed a group of people standing by the lake, their expressions unreadable. Their clothes looked old, maybe from the 1950s or earlier. Who are they? Jess asked, picking up one of the photos. Probably the original owners of the cabin, Luke said, leaning over her shoulder. But Maddie shook her head. No, look at the lake. We all leaned in, and that's when I saw it. In every photo, the lake's surface wasn't smooth like it was now. It was rippling, as if something beneath the water was moving. And in one of the photos there was a shadow, a long, dark shape just beneath the surface. What the hell is that? Ryan muttered. No one answered. That night the whispers returned, louder than ever. They seemed to come from all around us, circling the cabin like a pack of wolves. Maddie lit a fire in the fireplace even though the cabin wasn't cold, and Jess turned on every light we could find. But the light didn't help. If anything, it made the shadows seem darker, more alive. I sat by the window, staring out at the lake. It was pitch black, the water blending into the sky, but as I watched, I thought I saw something, a faint glow, like fireflies, hovering just above the surface. I blinked, and it was gone. You see it too, don't you? Maddie said, sitting down beside me. I nodded. What is it? She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I think it's waiting. Waiting for what? She looked at me, her eyes wide and filled with fear. For us. The whispers didn't stop until just before dawn. By then, we were all on edge, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows. No one mentioned leaving, but I could see it in their eyes. They were thinking about it. I was thinking about it. But something told me it wouldn't be that easy. Morning broke through the cabin's thin curtains, but it didn't feel like morning. The sunlight struggled to pierce the overcast sky, casting everything in a dull gray. Inside, we looked like the remnants of a battlefield, exhausted, jumpy, and unsure of what we were fighting. Jess was the first to speak, breaking the silence with a voice barely above a whisper. We can't stay another night here. Luke shook his head, his expression stoic. We don't leave until tomorrow. That was the plan. The plan changed when the lake decided it wanted to talk to us. Ryan shot back, his words dripping with sarcasm that couldn't hide his unease. Maddie sat in the corner, clutching the tin box. She hadn't let it out of her sight since last night, her fingers tracing its edges absently, as if it might reveal more secrets. It's not just the lake, she said, her voice steady but quiet. It's this place, the cabin, the woods, all of it. It's connected. Luke sighed heavily and rubbed his temples. We're not going to lose our minds over some creepy whispers and old photos. We stick to the plan. One more day, we'll be fine. Jess slammed her coffee mug down on the table, the sound jolting all of us. Fine. We're not fine, Luke. None of this is fine. You're pretending like. Her voice cracked, and she stopped, visibly trying to rein in her emotions. I leaned forward, trying to calm the situation. Look, maybe Luke's right about sticking to the plan, but we need to figure out what's going on here. Ignoring it isn't helping. Ryan chuckled bitterly. Yeah, great idea. Let's just figure out why the lake's whispering and why we're all too scared to sleep. That'll solve everything. Enough. Maddie interrupted, her voice commanding. For once, she stood and held up the tin box. This is a clue whether you want to admit it or not. Someone left this here for a reason, and we need to understand what it means. By mid-morning, we decided to split up again, though none of us felt great about it. Maddie insisted on staying at the cabin to study the photographs in the journal, while Luke and Ryan went to retrieve the second kayak they'd left by the far shore the previous day. Jess and I opted to follow the trail leading away from the cabin, hoping to find anything that might explain what was happening. The trail was narrow, flanked by trees whose branches intertwined overhead, forming a natural canopy. The air grew colder as we walked, our breath forming small clouds that hung in the still air. Do you believe her? Jess asked suddenly. I glanced at her. Who, Maddie? She nodded. All of it. The whispers, the shadows, the lake waiting. I hesitated. I don't know what to believe, but something's wrong here. It's not just in our heads. You feel it too, right? Jess stopped walking and turned to me, her eyes filled with fear. I don't just feel it. I see it. What do you mean? My voice dropped instinctively, as if speaking too loudly would summon whatever she'd seen. She hesitated, her gaze darting to the trees. Last night, when we were sitting by the fire, I saw something in the lake. It wasn't just a ripple or a shadow. It was watching us. I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. She must have taken my silence as skepticism because she looked away, shaking her head. Forget it, she muttered, starting to walk again. Jess, I called after her. I don't think you're crazy. I struggled to find the right words. I don't know how to process it. Neither of us said anything more as we continued down the trail. We came across an old, dilapidated structure about a mile from the cabin. It looked like it had once been a storage shed, though time and the elements had reduced it to little more than a skeleton of rotting wood and rusted nails. Jess and I exchanged a glance before cautiously stepping inside. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. Rusted tools hung on the walls, their edges dulled by years of neglect. But what caught my attention was the floor. Scrolled across the wooden planks were symbols, dozens of them, carved deeply into the wood as if someone had spent hours, maybe days, etching them. What the hell is this? Jess whispered, kneeling to get a closer look. The symbols were strange, almost tribal, but nothing I recognized. They spiraled and overlapped, creating patterns that seemed to twist and shift. If you stared too long, it looks deliberate, I said, my voice uneasy, like someone was trying to, I don't know, mark this place. Jess ran her fingers over one of the carvings, and her breath hitched. It's warm. I knelt beside her, touching the same symbol. She was right. It was warm to the touch, almost unnaturally so, given the freezing air around us. We should leave, I said quickly, standing up. Jess didn't argue. When we got back to the cabin, Luke and Ryan were already there. Ryan looked pale, and Luke's usual bravado was gone, replaced by a grim expression. What happened? I asked, sensing the tension. Luke hesitated, glancing at Ryan. The kayak's gone. What do you mean, gone? I mean it's not where we left it, Ryan said, his voice shaking. We checked the whole area. It's like it just disappeared. Maybe the wind carried it off, Luke offered, though he didn't sound convinced. There was no wind, Ryan snapped. And even if there was, it wouldn't drag a kayak that far. Something took it. Jess and I exchanged a worried look. We found something too, I said, explaining the symbols we'd seen in the shed. Maddie listened intently, her grip tightening on the tin box. It's all connected, she said when I finished. The photos, the journal, the symbols, warnings. Someone, maybe the people in those pictures, knew what was happening here, and they tried to stop it. Stop what? Ryan asked, his voice rising. What are we even talking about? Shadows, whispers. This whole thing is insane. It doesn't matter if it's insane, Maddie said sharply. It's real, and if we don't figure it out, we're not leaving this place. That night, the tension in the cabin was suffocating. We stayed in the living room, too afraid to separate. Maddie spread out the photographs and the journal on the coffee table, while the rest of us huddled close, our eyes darting to the windows every few seconds. As the hours passed, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, more distinct. They didn't just circle the cabin. They filled it, seeping into the walls and floorboards. Words began to form, though they were garbled and fragmented, like a voice trying to speak underwater. "Leave," one voice seemed to say. "Stay," another countered. The contradictions were maddening. Jess covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. Luke paced the room, muttering curses under his breath. Ryan sat frozen, staring at the floor, and then the lights flickered. When they came back on, Maddie was standing by the window, her face pale. "It's in the lake," she said, her voice barely audible. "What's in the lake?" I demanded, moving toward her. She turned to face me, her eyes wide with terror. "It's not waiting anymore." Outside, the lake was no longer still. The water rippled and churned, despite the absence of wind. And in the center, a shape began to emerge, tall, dark, and utterly inhuman. It wasn't waiting. It was coming. The air inside the cabin felt stifling, thick with the weight of our collective fear. We huddled in the living room, Maddie clutching the tin box like it was a lifeline, while Jess stared out the window, her breath fogging the glass. Ryan paced the room like a caged animal, muttering under his breath, while Luke tried and failed to maintain an air of control. Outside, the lake churned unnaturally. The ripples weren't just from the wind. They pulsed outward in rhythmic waves, like something beneath the surface was moving. The shape we'd glimpsed earlier had vanished, but its presence lingered, a palpable force pressing against us. I tried to focus, to think logically, but my mind kept circling back to one question: what is this thing? "We can't stay here," Jess said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "We need to leave. Now." "How?" Luke shot back. "The kayaks are gone, the trail's barely passable with all this snow. You want to freeze to death out there? It's better than staying here," she snapped. "That thing, whatever it is, it's coming for us. We don't even know what it wants," Maddie murmured, her eyes fixed on the tin box. "It doesn't matter what it wants," Ryan said, his voice sharp. "It's not playing games. Look at the lake. Look at what's happening. It's not waiting for us to figure this out." Silence fell over the room. None of us had an answer, but deep down, we all knew the truth. We were trapped. As the hours dragged on, we tried to distract ourselves, but the oppressive tension made it impossible. Luke started flipping through the journal, his skepticism eroding with every frantic entry he read. "They knew," he muttered, his finger tracing the erratic handwriting. "Whoever wrote this, they knew exactly what was here." "What does it say?" I asked. He flipped to a page near the back, holding it up so we could see. The words were scrawled in bold, uneven strokes, as if the writer had been shaking. "It's not the lake, it's what's beneath it. Don't disturb the water." Jess's face paled. "Beneath it? What does that mean?" "Exactly what it sounds like," Luke replied. "There's something under the lake, and if these entries are right, it doesn't want us here." Maddie set the tin box on the table, her hands trembling. "The photos," she whispered. "They all showed something in the water. A shadow, a shape." Ryan, who had been pacing, stopped abruptly. "So what? Are we just supposed to wait here for it to come get us?" "No," I said firmly. "We need to figure out what this thing is and how to stop it." "Stop it?" Ryan laughed bitterly. "Do you hear yourself? This isn't some ghost story where we find the magic words and everything's fine. This is real and it's going to kill us. Then what do you suggest? Maddie asked, her voice sharp. Running? Hiding? You saw what happened to the kayak. Do you really think it'll let us leave? Ryan opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. Instead, he sank into a chair, his head in his hands. By nightfall, the whispers returned. They started faint, like they had the first night, but quickly grew louder, more insistent. This time, they weren't just words. There were sounds, scraping, splashing, like claws against wood, and something heavy moving through water. Luke grabbed the journal and started flipping through it frantically. There has to be something here, some kind of clue. Quiet, Maddie interrupted, her eyes wide. Do you hear that? We all froze, straining to listen. The whispers seemed to converge, their voices overlapping until they became one guttural, incomprehensible sound. Then, suddenly it stopped. A loud thud echoed from the direction of the lake. We stared at each other, our breaths shallow, waiting for the next sound. Another thud followed, this one closer. And then the scraping began again, rhythmic and deliberate, like something was dragging itself closer. It's here, Jess whispered, tears streaming down her face. It's here. We have to move, I said, grabbing the flashlight from the table. We can't just sit here. And go where? Luke demanded. Out there, into the forest. It'll pick us off one by one. Before I could respond, the window behind Jess shattered, spraying glass across the room. She screamed, stumbling backward as something dark and wet lashed through the broken frame. It wasn't a hand, more like a tendril, long and sinewy, glistening with water and leaving streaks of black slime on the walls. Move! I shouted, grabbing Jess and pulling her away. The tendril writhed, sweeping across the room as if searching for something. Luke grabbed a fire poker and swung it, striking the thing with a sickening squelch. It recoiled, retreating back through the window, but we knew it wasn't gone. We can't stay here, Maddie said, her voice trembling. We need to get to the mine. The mine? Ryan looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Are you serious? You think hiding underground is going to save us? It's the only place we haven't searched, she said. The journal mentioned the mine. Maybe there's something there that can help. Or maybe it's where that thing came from, Ryan shot back. Do you have a better idea? Maddie snapped. The scraping outside grew louder, accompanied by deep, guttural noises that sent chills down my spine. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't leaving. Fine, Luke said. The mine it is. But we move fast. No stopping, no splitting up. We grabbed what supplies we could. A flashlight, the journal, the tin box, and bolted out the back door. The forest was eerily silent, the whispers having ceased entirely. The snow crunched beneath our boots as we made our way toward the mine, guided only by the dim beam of the flashlight. The entrance to the mine was a gaping black hole in the side of a hill, framed by rotting wooden beams that groaned under their own weight. The air was colder here, almost suffocatingly so, and the darkness seemed to pulse as if alive. We shouldn't be here, Ryan muttered, his voice barely audible. Keep moving, Luke said, pushing him forward. Inside the mine was narrow and damp, the walls slick with moisture. The beam of the flashlight illuminated strange carvings on the walls, symbols similar to the ones we'd seen in the shed. spiraling and interlocking in ways that made my head ache to look at. "This isn't right," Jess whispered. "These symbols, they're not just carvings, they're warnings." "Warnings for what?" Luke asked, though his voice betrayed his fear. Maddie stopped abruptly, holding up the flashlight to illuminate something ahead. In the center of the tunnel was a circular opening like a well, its edges lined with jagged stones. The air around it seemed to hum, a low, vibrating frequency that made my teeth ache. "What is this?" Ryan asked, his voice shaking. "It's a shaft," Maddie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It goes straight down to something." "To something?" Luke repeated. "What does that mean?" Before Maddie could answer, the humming grew louder, reverberating through the tunnel. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the shadows seemed to move, converging on the well. "We need to leave," Jess said, backing away. Now, but it was too late. The shadows coalesced, rising from the well like smoke. They weren't just dark, they were alive, their shapes shifting and twisting, forming something vaguely humanoid. Eyes, if they could even, Part 5, Into the Abyss, be called that, glowed faintly within the darkness, watching us. And then it spoke, its voice a guttural rasp that echoed through the tunnel. "You shouldn't have come." The flashlight went out. The darkness swallowed us whole. In the absence of light, the mind's oppressive cold seemed to deepen, wrapping around me like icy fingers. Jess's panicked breathing was the only sound, ragged and sharp in the suffocating silence. "Turn it back on," Ryan hissed, his voice trembling. "I'm trying." Luke's voice came from somewhere to my left, his frustration tinged with fear. The faint click of the flashlight switch was the only response. And then, as if taunting us, the guttural voice returned. "You were warned." The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep, resonant, and filled with something ancient. It wasn't just a voice, it was a feeling, a vibration that settled in my chest and threatened to suffocate me. "We have to move," Maddie whispered, her tone urgent but steady. "Follow the wall. Don't lose your bearings." I reached out blindly, my hand finding the damp, cold stone. Slowly I began to shuffle forward, keeping the wall to my right. The others followed, their footsteps uneven and hesitant. "Don't look back," Maddie added. Her words sent a chill down my spine. What did she think we'd see? The shadows didn't just stay in the well. They moved, creeping along the walls like living smoke. Occasionally I'd catch a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a tendril of darkness reaching toward me, only to retreat when I turned my head. "We're getting nowhere," Ryan muttered, his voice tight with panic. "We're just walking blind into." Crunch. Ryan stopped mid-sentence, his words replaced by a sharp intake of breath. "What was that?" Jess whispered. "I don't know," Ryan said, his voice barely audible. "I think I stepped on something." Luke fumbled with the flashlight again, and this time it sputtered to life, casting a weak, flickering beam. Ryan knelt, brushing away the dirt and revealing a collection of bones. Not animal bones, human. "Oh my God," Jess whispered, backing away. The flashlight revealed more bones scattered across the ground, some crushed, others arranged in strange, deliberate patterns. Symbols, spirals, and crude figures marked the floor, drawn with what looked like dried blood. "They didn't leave," Maddie said, her voice hollow. The people in the journal, this is what happened to them. Before anyone could respond, the humming returned, louder and more intense. The air vibrated, the frequency so low it felt like my skull was going to split. We can't stay here, I said, grabbing Maddie's arm. We have to get out. And go where? Luke snapped. You want to go back out there, to the lake? No one's saying that, I said. But staying here is worse. The shadows moved again, and this time they weren't just watching. A tendril of darkness shot out from the wall, wrapping around Luke's arm. He shouted in pain as the tendril pulled, dragging him toward the well. Help me, he screamed, his voice echoing through the mine. We all lunged at once, grabbing hold of him and pulling with everything we had. The tendril was cold, its surface slick and alive, pulsing like a heartbeat. It writhed, resisting us, and for a moment I thought we'd lose him. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the tendril snapped, retreating back into the shadows. Luke collapsed to the ground, clutching his arm. A dark mark, like a burn, marred his skin. It's getting stronger, Maddie said, her voice shaking. We woke it up. Then we need to put it back to sleep, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Whatever it is, it's tied to this place. The lake, the mine, the symbols. There has to be a way to stop it, or it stops us, Ryan muttered. We pressed on, the flashlight our only lifeline. The deeper we went, the more the mine seemed to change. The walls grew smoother, the symbols more intricate, as if the mine itself were alive, reshaping to guide us or trap us. Finally, we came to a large cavern, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. In the center was a massive stone altar, its surface etched with the same spiraling patterns we'd seen before. Surrounding it were more bones, arranged in concentric circles. This is it, Maddie said, her voice barely a whisper. This is where it started, and where it ends. You shouldn't have come, the guttural voice replied, sending a ripple of terror through the group. The shadows in the room began to converge, pooling around the altar like ink spreading through water. From the center, the dark shape began to rise again, its form shifting and twisting. It was humanoid, but only barely, its limbs too long, its movements too fluid. Eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly within the blackness. Maddie stepped forward, holding the tin box. This is why we found it, she said, her voice trembling but determined. It's a key. It has to be a key. To what? I asked, my heart pounding. To lock it away, she replied. The people in the photos, they tried to stop it. That's why they left the journal, the symbols they didn't finish. But maybe we can. The shadow creature stepped closer, its presence oppressive. It didn't attack, but it didn't need to. Just being near it felt like drowning, like my very existence was being pulled into its void. What do we do? Luke asked, his voice cracking. Maddie opened the tin box, revealing the faded photographs inside. She pulled one out, holding it up to the light. The figures in the photo stared back at us, their faces solemn, their hands raised as if in prayer. Replicate the symbols, she said, pointing to the altar. Quickly, we scrambled to copy the patterns from the photos onto the altar, using pieces of chalk we'd found earlier in the mine. The symbols glowed faintly as we worked, the air around us growing heavier with each stroke. The shadow creature roared, its form expanding, tendrils lashing out in every direction. One struck Ryan, sending him sprawling across the cavern. Jess screamed, but she didn't stop drawing. "Hurry!" Maddie shouted. As we completed the final symbol, the cavern shook violently. The light from the symbols intensified, forming a barrier of blinding energy around the altar. The shadow creature writhed and screamed, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind, and then it was gone. We stumbled out of the mine hours later, exhausted but alive. The lake was still, the oppressive presence lifted. For the first time in days, the air felt light, almost peaceful. We kept moving, though the tension between us was palpable. But as we walked, the whispers grew louder. No longer faint suggestions, but full voices, overlapping and echoing in the air around us. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the intent was clear. Turn back. Ryan was the first to crack. He stopped abruptly, shaking his head. "I can't do this," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't. I'm not going back there." "No one's going back," I said firmly, grabbing his arm. "We're almost out." But Ryan shook his head violently, pulling away. "You don't get it. It's not going to let us leave. We're already dead." "Don't say that," Jess snapped, tears streaming down her face. "We're not dead. We're not." Ryan laughed bitterly, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "You think we made it out of that mine alive? You think it just let us go?" "Ryan, stop," I said, stepping toward him. "You're not thinking straight." "No," he said, backing away. "You're the ones who aren't thinking. This place, it's already taken us. We just haven't realized it yet." Before I could stop him, Ryan turned and bolted into the woods, his figure disappearing quickly into the shadows. The sound of his footsteps was swallowed by the oppressive silence. "Ryan!" Jess screamed, starting after him, but I grabbed her arm. "No," I said firmly. "We can't follow him. That's what it wants." She struggled against me, but Maddie stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "He's gone," Maddie said softly. "We can't save him." The rest of the walk was a blur. The whispers grew louder, the air heavier, and the forest darker. By the time we reached the trailhead, I could barely stand. The others looked just as drained, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. But the road was there. The snow-covered asphalt stretched out before us like a lifeline, leading back to civilization. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The whispers didn't stop. Maddie was the first to speak, her voice barely audible. "It's not over." "What do you mean?" Luke demanded, his voice fraying at the edges. "We're out. We're safe." She shook her head, holding up the journal. The last entry. It said it doesn't want us to leave. We didn't leave it behind. It's still with us. "No," Jess whispered, backing away. "No, we're safe. We made it out." But even as she said the words, the truth was clear. The oppressive feeling hadn't lifted. The weight in my chest, the whispers in my ears, they weren't fading, they were getting stronger. "We have to go back," Maddie said, her voice breaking. "We have to finish it." "No," Luke said firmly, "absolutely not. I'm not going back there. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out later. But I'm not stepping foot in that place again." "You don't understand," Maddie said, tears streaming down her face. "If we don't stop it, it'll spread. It'll follow us. It'll follow everyone. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating and undeniable. And then the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It wasn't natural. It was a vacuum, a void that pressed down on us like a tidal wave. And then I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the edge of the road, the shadows began to move. They coalesced, forming a shape, a tall, inhuman figure with glowing eyes that stared directly at us. It wasn't waiting anymore. I don't know what happened after that. The next thing I remember, I was standing on the side of the road, alone. The others were gone. The journal, the tin box, everything was gone. The only thing left was the sound of the wind and the faint echo of a voice in my mind. You were never supposed to leave. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the forest. Eventually a car passed, and I flagged it down. The driver asked if I was okay, but I couldn't answer. I just nodded, got in, and told them to drive. I've tried to forget what happened, but I can't. The whispers haven't stopped. They're quieter now, but they're always there, in the back of my mind. And at night, when I close my eyes, I see the lake. I see the shadows. And I know it's still waiting for me, for all of us. April 2nd. It has been 4 days now, and it still hasn't moved away from in front of the door. I came across this journal earlier today while I was going through all of the supplies, trying to figure out what I have to work with and what I might have to ration. I thought that writing in it would be a good way to help pass the time until either help comes or I see a chance to run for it. After all, since there's no electricity up here, I don't have a television or a radio to keep myself occupied. And even if I did, I doubt that I could bring myself to turn them on. Even the idea of making more noise than I have to, of really making any noise at all, fills me with dread. It's mostly due to the fact that I don't want to attract its attention any more than I already have, and give it further reason to continue sticking around. And, admittedly, somewhat because I worry about being unable to hear any possible changes outside. This constant paranoia makes it a challenge even to try reading some of the books and magazines that we brought up here with us. I can't really bring myself to concentrate on whatever it is that I'm trying to read. I'm too distracted, too busy jumping out of my skin over every creak of timber or gust of wind to really focus on any of it. I read the words, and then the door crowds them back out of my mind. The sounds that it makes during the night make it impossible to do anything other than cower up here in the loft, staring unblinkingly down at the door and praying to God to just make this thing go away already, or for the sun to come up so that at least it will quiet back down for the day. Sometimes I honestly don't know which is worse, the tense silence during the days or listening to the door creak and moan as whatever the hell that thing is pushes on it all night long, while endlessly, wordlessly screaming at me. No, the nights are the worst, and I know it. And so I have decided to start writing in this journal so that I'll at least have something to do with my time other than just sitting here and staring at the door all day, just waiting for something to happen and praying that nothing will. The journal must be one of Katie's. She's always scribbling and writing in these things, especially when we come up here to the cabin, but I'm certain she won't mind my using it. Dear God, I hope she's all right. I hope that she's found help. April 3rd. Still no changes. Last night it started its screaming a few hours after sunset, pushing heavily on the door, seemingly trying to force its way inside. I honestly don't know which is worse, The fact that the sound is so incredibly human in nature, or the fact that something about it simultaneously makes it glaringly inhuman and unnatural. There is something about it, some quality that seems somehow familiar, and yet at the same time utterly alien to me. That vague feeling of familiarity frightens me more than anything else. Somehow it makes me think of an article I read once years ago about something called the Uncanny Valley. They said that it described feelings of revulsion towards something that closely imitated human life, but was still obviously something else. I can't think of a better term for the sounds this thing makes. Each morning, after the sun has come up and the thing has gone quiet for the day, I have removed my barricades and inspected the door. And so far, it still seems to be holding up fairly well. The hinges and locks remain firm and unbent, despite the creaking I have heard during the nighttime assaults. The wood doesn't seem to be cracking or warping anywhere. I've braced it up as best I could with what I have, but I don't really have much to work with. What furniture there is, a few assorted tools, a bit of rope. I don't know that wedging the couch up against the door is doing much good, but at least it's something. No, I think that it has everything to do with the quality of the door itself. My father really put his heart into it years ago when he built this place, and he built everything in here to last, from the roof to that door. All that had meant before was that Katie and I would have a nice place up in the mountains for years to come, where we could get away from the city for a while, a place where we could enjoy being in nature and the smell of fresh air, and just being together with each other. Now his craftsmanship seems to be the only thing standing between me and I don't even want to know. Thank God that he decided against putting any windows in the place when he built it. The fireplace still worries me, but I imagine that it must be too narrow for that thing to fit down. At least I hope that it is. I spent this morning gathering up all of the empty buckets, jars, and tubs that I could find and filling them with water from the hand pump he built in the kitchen area. I don't honestly even know why I did it. I really can't see how it would reasonably be able to tamper with the well or affect the water supply. And yet, all the same, it felt like the right thing to do. Besides, the last thing I need is to run out of water somehow, and a bit of precaution isn't going to hurt anything. If nothing else, it gave me something to occupy my time with. There's enough canned food stored up here to last me for quite some time, especially if I rationed it a bit. But I hope that there won't be too much of a need to worry about that. I have to imagine that whatever it is out there is either going to get tired of trying to get at me or waiting on me to come out, or that help comes. But it's always better to be safe than sorry. It's hard to believe that just 5 days ago, Katie and I were driving up here, laughing like we were teenagers again, talking about when we wanted to go for a hike and when we wanted to do some fishing, and how nice it was going to be to get out of the city for an entire month, and just how much we needed it. To think that was less than a week ago, and now it somehow seems like a memory from another time, like seeing something from someone else's life. Despite how much we had enjoyed the drive up here, I had known that something was wrong almost as soon as we got out of the car. At first, I could not figure out what seemed to be bothering me, but as we were carrying things in from the car and unpacking, the wind had changed. A strange odor, almost a sort of musk, had drifted in out of the forest on the breeze, and when I smelled it, I had nearly dropped the box I was carrying. I saw the color drain from Katie's face when she came back outside and smelled it as well. She asked me what it could be while covering her nose with her shirt, but I told her that I didn't know. I had no answer for her, as it was nothing quite like I had ever smelled before. It wasn't a particularly strong smell, or even all that putrid. But there had been something wrong about it, something invasive and unclean. You see, my father had been bringing me up here and on camping trips for as long as I could remember, and so I was no stranger to the smells of death and decay. I could still remember that once when I was young, we had been hiking and had found a dead deer in the water, and that we hadn't been able to get the smell entirely out of our clothes for days. But this was something entirely different. The instant I had smelled it, the hair stood up on the back of my neck, and my stomach had tightened into a knot. I had felt the overpowering urge to climb back into the car, start driving, and never ever look back, the need to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was causing that smell. I had told Katie as much, and though it obviously bothered her as well, she had laughed and told me that it was only some dead thing out in the woods, that I was being silly and getting upset over nothing. Now, looking back at how pale her face had been and how nervous that laugh had sounded, I know that she hadn't really believed that. God, why couldn't she have just trusted me? Were you just too proud to admit that you felt the same feelings of terror that I had? Or maybe it had simply been because it had taken us so long to manage to finally set up an entire month off from work together. It had taken more than a couple of sacrifices on both our parts, but we had known that it was really going to be worth it. Maybe that's why she refused to go, and maybe it's how she finally convinced me to stay. And so, instead, we had continued unloading the car, unpacking everything we would need, getting ready to settle in for the next month together. I had been unable to keep myself from glancing at the forest any time we were outside, half expecting to see something, though I could not say what, out there in the shadows. I had known that Katie was right, that something had simply died nearby, and yet, no matter how many times I told myself that, I still could not quite make myself believe it. I don't think Katie did either, though she hid it better than I could. It seemed as though the longer we were around the smell, the more intense my discomfort became, and I felt the beginnings of a tension headache begin to steadily spread from the back of my head. By the end, I think that the only thing that had really kept me here was the fact that I was going to propose to her while we were up here. I can't even stand to look at the ring right now, and I know that I won't be able to until I know that she's safe, that she's all right. Until I can know that, until I can hold her in my arms again, it has become nothing more than a symbol of how much I might have lost, and what a fool I was for letting us stay. Katie, wherever you are, know that I love you. April 4th. Still no changes to report. Just another night of that damned thing trying to force in the door, screaming at me hour after hour, all through the night. Why does it scream like that? Is it hoping that it can scare me out of my little hole here, thinking that it can frighten me into making some sort of a run for it? Could it serve some sort of purpose beyond my understanding? Perhaps it's intelligent and just derives some sort of sick pleasure from knowing that it's tormenting me in here. I'm not about to try asking it. I have enough difficulty just bringing myself to get close enough to the door in order to check it for damage anymore. Just knowing that it's sitting there on the other side, waiting. It's just too much for me to handle at this point. I know that I should man up and move the rubber stopper away from the bottom of the door, that I should be trying to watch it and see if it either comes and goes or just incessantly sits there waiting, day in and day out. I know that I should, but I can't bring myself to do it. I just can't handle the idea of those eyes staring in here under the door. That would be even worse than the screaming, and that's already almost more than I can bear. I saw them once, and that was more than enough. My headache had grown steadily worse as the day had gone on until it had become almost unbearable, and I knew that I would have to lie down for a while. Katie had suggested that it was most likely due to the change in altitude during the drive up here, that she knew it could sometimes cause headaches like this. Of course, I reminded her that this had never happened to me before, and that I had been coming up here for years now. She simply reminded me that I was getting old and that these things happen eventually. I settled for taking some aspirin to help ease the pain in my head, climbing up into the loft, and lying down in bed while she finished unpacking things and setting up around the cabin. I had made her promise to wake me up if she needed anything and to not go too far from the cabin until after I had woken up. I didn't even want her to go outside without me, but I knew that she would have been upset by that. In the end, she told me that I was being silly but promised nonetheless, and I fell asleep almost immediately after lying down. When I awoke, the smell had become a stench, overpowering enough to leave me gagging. I cannot properly describe it even now, after having spent all these days with it. Have you ever been down into an old root cellar, or some damp, dark place in the earth? Perhaps a house that has recently flooded or suffered from a long leaking roof. That damp, musty, clinging smell of mildew and mold. There was something of both of those to it. Added to that were traces of rot and putrefaction. There was also a cloying, almost sickly sweet quality to it that was somehow even worse than the stink of decay. Something acidic, almost chemical as well. It was a dozen terrible smells, all wrapped up into one repugnant, awful stench. Finally, I could hold it back no longer, and I leaned over the side of the bed and heaved onto the floor. Once I had finished, I called out to Katie, but received no response. I felt weak and bewildered as I tried to climb out of the bed, and I practically fell into my own vomit more than once. I called out to her again, more urgently now. Still nothing. I began to cry out for her frantically. Nothing. I made my way down the ladder to the floor of the cabin, and in my haste and in my current state, I nearly fell at one point. I might have broken my neck if I had fallen from that high, and part of me wishes that I had. I wandered the cabin, coughing and choking from the smell, occasionally stopping to retch and heave, until I realized that she was not in here with me. I turned towards the door, stumbling towards it, feeling my panic grow with every passing second. I knew that I had to find her, and get her in the car and get us as far away from this place as possible, no matter how silly it might have sounded to her. As I drew closer to the door, the smell became steadily stronger, and I realized that whatever it was coming from must have moved closer somehow. As I reached out for the door, I was overcome by a sense of dread. I suddenly knew that I could no more bring myself to reach out and twist that knob than I could pluck the moon from the sky or sprout wings and fly away from this place. No, some part of me, some animal instinct residing quietly until now in the back of my brain, knew that I must not open that door and held me back from doing so, for reasons equally beyond my understanding. I instead dropped down and pulled away at the rubber stopper that we had installed upon the bottom of the door. You see, as the cabin had settled and subtly shifted over the years, a small gap had formed beneath the bottom of the door. It was no more than a couple of inches, but still enough to let in a draft or a bit of rain if the wind blew the right way. And so we had installed a bit of rubber along its bottom to properly seal it up. I pulled that away now, and despite how strong the smell was as it poured in through the new gap, I leaned down and looked outside. Darkness, or at least what I at first took to be darkness, all across the bottom of the door. All that I could see was pure, unbroken black. I was momentarily confused. It had still been fairly early in the morning when we had arrived and I had laid down. Surely I hadn't slept that long. I looked at my watch, only to discover that it was barely past 3:00 in the afternoon, meaning that I had only slept for a couple of hours. I sat there in confusion for a moment, trying to piece it all together, and looked beneath the door once again. The longer I looked out, the more and more I came to realize that I was not looking into some lightless distance, but rather at an object lying before the door. From what I could tell, it seemed to be incredibly smooth, and though I could not be certain, the way that it caught the light from inside made it seem as though its surface might be of either a damp or slimy texture. The first thing to spring to mind was of some colossal black slug laid out before the doorway, and I nearly vomited once again. As I lay there staring at it, I noticed that a spot on its surface was becoming gradually lighter than the rest. I fixed my eye upon it and watched with mixed horror and curiosity as a white object, about the size of a quarter, seemed to arise from within the substance to sit upon the surface. The only way in which I can describe it is to say that it looked somewhat like a peeled grape, except that it was entirely white. As I watched, more began to steadily surface, ranging in size from a dime to what I would estimate was likely closer to my fist, all of them looking like peeled albino grapes. I lay for some time watching these things, trying to figure out just what I was seeing, when it began to dawn upon me. I slowly slid myself across the floor to the other side of the doorway, and they twitched, following me in my movement. They were eyes. I screamed then and launched myself back away from the door, moving as far away as possible. Eventually, I stared at the stack of papers on my desk. Another one. Another dead animal. This time it was a couple of elk, ripped apart like a kid's toy. This wasn't normal, not even for the wilderness around Misty Pines. Just last week, it was 3 deer, mangled the same way. Whatever was doing this, it wasn't your average bear or mountain lion. Got another one this morning, Ed said from behind me. I turned to see him holding a file, his face grim. Up at Cricket Creek, trying to figure out the pattern here, I muttered, shuffling the reports. Any connection to the other cases? Same as the rest, he said, dropping the new file on my desk. I flipped it open. The photos made my stomach churn. I shoved the file aside, suddenly not hungry anymore. This is getting out of hand, I said, glancing around the room. The maps, the posters about bear safety, it all felt so pointless now. When I first got here, I thought the worst I'd have to deal with was the occasional grumpy bear. Ed chuckled, settling into the chair across from me. The old wood creaked under his weight. You're thinking about the first time, right? The W word? I laughed, but it came out a little shaky. Yeah, Your face was priceless when I told you about it. Ed grinned, his wrinkles deepening. Thought you were gonna quit on me right then and there. Almost did, I admitted, leaning back. Remember, we were tracking what I thought was a mountain lion. I told you they don't leave footprints that change size and shape as they walk. Ed nodded, the fluorescent light flickering above us. Nicole called, he said, his voice turning serious. They're seeing similar things in her district. My stomach sank. If Nicole was involved, it was serious. How bad? Bad enough she's driving up today. Be here in an hour, maybe less. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 9:47 a.m. The elders called too, he added. That made me feel sick. The local Native American community didn't call unless something was very wrong. When was the last time they called? I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Ed hesitated. 15 years ago. We lost 3 good rangers that winter. The room went silent. I stared at the map on the wall, where I'd marked every attack with a red pin. It wasn't random, it was a spiral, and it was closing in on us. Matt, Ed said, using my first name, which was rare for him. The way you reacted to all this when you first got here. The doubt, the disbelief. That's how a normal person is supposed to feel. That's good. But what happens next? He trailed off. We need your skepticism to be on our side, not against us. Yeah, I said, my eyes glued to the map. The attacks were getting closer together both in time and distance. What does that mean to you? It's hunting, I said, a chill running down my spine. But not for food. It's testing limits, gaining knowledge. Ed finished, growing confident. The door flew open and Nicole stood there, breathless. She was early. Come look at this, she said, thrusting her phone at me. New tracks, just came in 10 minutes ago, half a mile west. I stood up. It wasn't about believing anymore. Something was out there, and it was heading towards Misty Pines. Let's go talk to the elders, Ed said. And we all nodded. As we walked towards the exit, Ed looked at me, a knowing glint in his eye, like he'd expected this all along, like he'd been waiting for me to come around. I didn't like that thought one bit. We piled into Ed's Jeep and headed for the eastern trailhead. The sun was up, but the mist hadn't burned off yet. The crunch of gravel under the tires faded as we entered the woods. Nicole led the way, her footsteps silent and sure. My mind drifted back to the first time Ed had taken me tracking in these woods. It seemed like a fitting memory to revisit. You're real quiet back there, Ed said, his voice just loud enough to hear. Reflecting on the day you taught me the W word, I replied. Nicole glanced over her shoulder. Ed told me about that. We were walking single file now, the air thick and humid. The branches overhead were so dense, they barely let any sunlight through. It was here, Ed said, stopping beside a fallen log covered in glowing mushrooms. Right, Matt? I remembered. About 6 months ago. We were hunting something else then, but the blood had been black. You thought it was a mountain lion, I said, a weak smile tugging at my lips. And you thought I was crazy, Ed chuckled. It felt like I was that same newbie again, experiencing it all over again. Here, Ed said, pointing to a large pine tree. This is where we found the first tracks. I remembered those footprints. They looked like a wolf's at first, but then they started morphing. growing bigger, wider. You got real quiet, Ed continued, his voice taking on that storyteller tone he used when he was about to drop some serious knowledge. You just kept measuring them with your ruler. Nicole sat down on a fallen log, ready to listen. Because they couldn't be, I said. Tracks don't just change size. But these did, Ed said. The atmosphere had changed. A stick snapped in the distance, and we all froze. When I told you about the winter of '82, Ed went on, the hunting party that disappeared up at Crystal Lake, I leaned against a tree, the memory vivid. You said they found only pieces of them, and there were tracks all around the campsite, like something had been walking on two legs, but with footprints too long and twisted to be human. And then you said the word, Nicole said, looking at Ed expectantly. Wendigo, Ed said, and the woods seemed to echo the word back at us. I remembered laughing when Ed first told me about it. I thought you were just messing with the new guy, I admitted, until we found the deer, Ed said, his expression darkening. That deer hadn't just been killed. It had been mutilated, twisted into something unnatural. The elders say seeing is believing, Nicole said softly. But also that believing is seeing. You have to have faith in what's out there. Once you do, you'll start seeing things that have been there all along. But you just didn't notice because you didn't believe. Thunder rumbled in the distance, even though I was sure there wasn't supposed to be any rain today. The forest felt different now, like it was watching me. After that day, Ed said, stepping away from the tree, you started carrying silver bullets. Yep, I said, patting my gun. And iron ones, and the holy ones the elders gave us. Nicole looked back at us, her eyes wide, speaking of things that were hidden. She crept forward, and I followed, Ed close behind. We were all staring at the ground now, at another set of those strange footprints. How long has it been? Ed asked, his voice barely a whisper. Nicole examined the tracks carefully. An hour ago, maybe less. And look, she pointed to the next print. It's changing. The second print was smaller but still not human. The third was different again. It's nearby, Ed said, straightening up. And it's not bothering to hide anymore. A branch snapped nearby, followed by a noise like a hungry wind. We all reached for our weapons. The elders, I said, trying to sound calm. You need to take me to them immediately. That's what I'm afraid of, Ed said. This isn't just a game anymore. This is a lure. We backed away slowly, our eyes glued to the forest. I thought about how far I'd come since my first day. I'd been so skeptical about all this, and now I was at the forefront of the battle against it. The forest knew that too, and that was the scariest part of all. We didn't sleep that night. Instead, we drove back to town and called in reinforcements. Ed and I were on the phone all night, rounding up every officer and specialist we could find who had any experience with this kind of thing. The next morning, the meeting area outside the station was packed. Everyone was buzzing, clutching coffee cups and staring at maps. Ed caught my eye and motioned me over. Hey man, he said, his voice low. There's something over here you need to see. I pushed through the crowd and saw the map covered in new red pins. It wasn't a spiral anymore. It was something else. Nicole's over there, Ed said, nodding towards the parking lot. I saw her climbing out of her truck. She looked the same, except for a new scar on her cheek. Worse in her district? I asked. already knowing the answer. Much worse, Ed said grimly. 2 rangers died last week. Nicole walked up to us, her eyes scanning the crowd. Matt, she said, her voice tight. Wish it was under better circumstances. Yeah, well, I started. That track we found last month, she said, cutting me off. That was just the beginning. We're seeing new patterns, but they're changing so fast we can't even keep up. She pulled out a stack of photos and spread them on the map. They made the ones from last month look like child's play. Fusion, Nicole said, pointing to one of the most disturbing images. Multiple creatures fused together in ways that shouldn't be possible. I finished, my voice catching in my throat. The crowd around us was growing, the mood somber. The elders say it's getting ready for something, Ed said. Something besides territory marking or hunting. Nicole pulled out her own map and laid it over ours. The attacks are forming something, she said. A pattern in the pattern. A ritual, I breathed. Exactly, Ed said. Which is why you and Nicole will be going out today. The elders gave me these. He pulled 2 small leather pouches from his jacket. Protection charms. You're going to need them. Nicole took hers without hesitation. I slipped mine on too. We have 4 hours before sundown, she said, glancing at her watch. We need to reach the North Ridge before then. I'll get the gear ready, I said, heading towards the equipment shed. Matt, Ed called after me. Remember what I taught you. Remember what you learned. I nodded, my stomach churning. Holy water, silver bullets, iron chains, the usual. 10 minutes later, Nicole and I were loading up the truck. You've done this before, I said, watching her expertly cycle through the radio frequencies. More than I care to count, she replied grimly. I lost my partner 3 months ago. This thing we're chasing, it's getting smarter, evolving. I turned the key in the ignition, and we set off down the Forest Service road. You said the protocol for tracking it was different now, I said as we climbed higher into the mountains. Yeah, it can't be tracked the normal way anymore. You have to get inside its head. And how does a shape-shifting monster think? Like a natural, unnatural thing, she said. It uses patterns you can't see, paths you can't walk unless you don't walk them, I finished, remembering Ed's lessons. She looked at me, a flicker of approval in her eyes. That's right. They taught me to hear the spaces between the tracks. We rounded a bend, and the valley spread out before us. Somewhere down there, a monster was drawing its circle. We'll head to where it last struck, Nicole said, downshifting as the road steepened. Then we'll follow its trail in reverse until we find out where it was going. I looked at my gun, hoping the bullets inside would work on whatever this thing was. And what do we do then? We hope the elders prepared us well enough. The road was getting rough now, and I had the feeling we were being watched. Whatever this thing was, it was expecting us, counting on us being there. It was probably laughing at us in its own sick way. It wasn't getting any easier to believe, but I knew I would have to soon. We were about to meet it face to face, and I had a feeling it would be very real. The truck crawled up the mountain road for another 20 minutes, the rain pouring down and fog swirling around us. Visibility was almost zero. Finally, we reached the end of the road at an old fire service lookout. Ready? Nicole asked, checking her rifle one last time. as I'll ever be, I said, pulling the leather cord with the protection charm tighter around my neck. It was already soaked with sweat. We stepped out of the truck into the downpour. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay. The campsite should be half a mile east, Nicole said, consulting her GPS. The brush was dense, forcing us to walk single file. I watched Nicole's every move, how she stepped, how she scanned the surroundings, not just the ground but the trees, the shadows. "Wait," she said suddenly, crouching down. I stopped, following her gaze. "The branches," she whispered. "They're bent. Recent. Yeah. See how wet the tree is?" I said, catching on. "The campers came this way," she said, pointing to a scrap of neon orange cloth snagged on a bramble. "But they were being shepherded." "Shepherded? Notice how the snapped branches form a path. It's too neat, intentional." She was right. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. There was a path of destruction leading into the woods. We followed it, the rain starting to ease up. I saw more signs of a struggle. Trees with deep gouges in their bark, places where something heavy had fallen, claw marks that started at shoulder height and went up from there. "This is the place," Nicole said, stopping at the edge of a small clearing. The campsite was a mess. A tent was shredded, camping gear scattered everywhere, some of it crushed, some untouched. "Hey," I said, kneeling beside a backpack. "Most of the stuff is scattered, but there's one thing that stands out. A hiking boot. Looks almost new." Nicole knelt beside me, her face grim. "Farmer's boots." "What?" "These aren't hiking boots. Look at the tread. They're farmer's work boots." But the campers were all college kids on spring break. Ed's words echoed in my mind. Once you start seeing the patterns, you can't unsee them. "Maybe they borrowed them," I offered weakly. "No, city kids don't wear steel-toed work boots on a camping trip. And look at the size. It's huge." She took out a tape measure and started measuring the boot. Every time she did, it came out slightly different. "Matt," she said, her voice strained, "these prints, they're similar to last month's. But what? They're more advanced." A branch snapped behind us, and we both whirled around. "We should follow them," Nicole said, her eyes fixed on the forest. "But first, what do you see out there? What do you really see?" I ignored the obvious signs of a struggle and focused on the details. "It's too clean," I said. "Staged," Nicole said. "Like a theatrical campsite incident." More branches snapped, and I heard something that sounded like footsteps, but not quite. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. "Yeah, just one thing." Nicole reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver bell tied to a red string. She hung it from a nearby branch. "Just in case," she said, nodding towards the bell. We headed off in the direction of the tracks, which were getting harder to interpret. They started out human, then became longer, deeper, twisting into bizarre shapes that made my eyes hurt. The forest grew darker, even though it was still morning. It felt like twilight. The rain had stopped, but water dripped from the branches, sounding like something sneaking up on us. Every time we turned around, there was nothing there. "Nicole," I said, pointing to a tree up ahead. "Do you see that?" There was a carving on the tree, a strange symbol that looked like a spiral. But when I looked at it for too long, it seemed to spin. "Don't look at it," Nicole said, tugging my arm. Some symbols are designed to keep you looking. The bell behind us rang one more time, then fell silent. I didn't know why, but I felt like it meant we had crossed a line. We had entered the hunting ground. The further we got from the spiral tree, the more time seemed to slow down. Every step felt like we were wading through molasses. The forest grew darker, the sounds of the forest fading away. I glanced back and saw the spiral tree disappear behind us. Nicole stopped and raised her hand. I froze, listening, but there was nothing. "Matt," she whispered. "Look down." I followed her gaze. The footprints were gone. "What? No, it can't be." "Ed's first rule," Nicole said, clutching her rifle. "If you don't see their footprints, don't follow them." There were a few leaves on the ground where the tracks should have been, but they were moving the wrong way, as if the wind was blowing them backwards. "We need to go back," I said, even though I knew what she'd say. "We can't. We're almost there." Her voice was shaking, which I didn't think I'd ever heard before. "And it's behind us now, between us and the truck." I knew she was right. I drew my gun, the silver bullets heavy in the chamber, and aimed it at the shadows. "How can you tell?" I asked. "The birds," she said. "They're flying the other way, away from the thing behind us." "And the moss?" I looked where she was pointing. The moss on the trees was now pointing straight at us. A stick cracked nearby, and Nicole pulled out her compass, her hands trembling. "Matt," she said, her voice low. "Remember what Ed said about it learning?" "Yeah, I think it learned how to hunt hunters." I was about to respond when I heard a strange noise, like a cross between laughter and howling, coming from the woods. "Go," Nicole said, her voice urgent. "Just go." We ran, not bothering to track anymore, just moving. The forest was changing around us, morphing. "The charm," I gasped, the leather burning against my skin. I feel it," Nicole said, her voice strained. "Either we're close, or it's close to us." There was another noise, footsteps, but something was wrong with them, as if whoever was walking wasn't used to it. It was coming from behind us, then beside us, then in front of us. "Nicole," I said, my voice tight. The footprints, more footprints were appearing in the dirt ahead of us. They started as farmers' boots, then changed into something else entirely. "It's hurting us," she said, the color draining from her face, like it did with the campers. The wind picked up, and I caught a whiff of that sickly sweet stench again. The sigil on my neck burned even hotter. "Choices?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. Nicole was scanning the trees, looking for something, anything, to help us. "If we can just break its pattern, so we don't do either?" Something dark and shadowy moved between the trees, something too tall and fluid to be human. "The amulet," I gasped. "We make our own pattern," Nicole said, rummaging through her backpack. She pulled out more of the silver bells and started arranging them in a circle around us. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Something the elders taught me. The last resort." She continued placing the bells. "When the circle is complete, don't leave it." The trees seemed to grow darker. That weird laugh echoed again. "Nicole," I started to say. "Just a sec, one more." She placed the final bell, completing the circle. There. Immediately, I felt a difference. The charm stopped burning and was instead pleasantly warm. The darkness was still there, but it didn't feel quite so oppressive. "What now?" I asked. watching the shadows dancing at the edge of our safe space. Now, Nicole said, her voice steadier, we wait, and we remember that this thing isn't just a hunter. It's a learner. The bells began to ring, one at a time, even though there was no wind. And in the darkness, something watched us, taking notes. Hours passed. We sat in the circle, listening to the chiming bells, the light fading around us. High noon turned to dusk in the blink of an eye, as if someone had dimmed the sun. Our protective circle seemed to be holding, but time was moving differently now. Your battery still good? Nicole asked, fiddling with her phone. I tried my flashlight. It died after a second. Not anymore. Yeah, me too. She gestured to her radio, which was only playing static. Nothing electronic is working. At least the protection charm is still working, I said. It was pretty much the only piece of equipment that was. The shadows outside the circle were growing larger, and the stench was getting worse. It's testing the boundary, Nicole said, as leaves started swirling around the perimeter of our haven. I heard a laugh from the woods, too slow and drawn out to be human. That's new, I said. It's learning, Nicole said, clutching her rifle, getting better at pretending. The chuckle came again, a little closer this time, then a voice, as if it was trying to learn how to speak. Cold here. I didn't answer, remembering Ed's warning. Nicole scooted closer to me. No matter what, she whispered, do not answer it. Don't even think about it. Help us now, the voice pleaded, coming from all around us. Multiple voices overlapping. It's the campers, Nicole whispered. It's mimicking them. My flashlight flickered back on, and I saw a boot print in the dirt just beyond the bells, as if a farmer's boot was pressing down into the soil. Nicole, I see it. Another print appeared next to it, but this one was different, longer, with too many toes. Then another, human-like but backward. They surrounded us, changing shape with every step. It's showing us, Nicole said, her voice trembling. Showing us how it works. The voices went on, and after a while, I realized I could hear snippets of what they were saying. Let's make camp here. Who's there? We're being watched. The bells were ringing louder now, drowning out my thoughts. The heat from the charm intensified. Nicole grabbed at her own charm as it started to burn. How long can we stay like this? I asked, my voice tight. The tracks were multiplying, tracing circles around us. Until morning, she said, her voice strained. Or until the leftmost bell stopped ringing. No, Nicole whispered, her face white. No, no, no. Another bell went silent. And then another. Matt, Nicole said, panic creeping into her voice. Remember when Ed was talking about patterns? Yeah, we need to make one. Right now. She pulled out a small pouch of salt and dust, another gift from the elders, and started drawing symbols on the ground around us. The whispers grew louder. The tracks multiplied, becoming even more impossible. I heard footsteps coming closer from every direction. Hurry up, I urged as the bells continued to fall silent. Whatever you're doing, hurry up. Just about done. Nicole drew another symbol, her hand shaking. The ringing subsided, and then darkness enveloped us. The voices became one, laughing, screaming, wanting, and then something was there, outside Nicole's smaller circle of protection. We weren't meant to see it. My eyes hurt just trying to look at it as it took on too many shapes at once. "Don't stare at it," Nicole said, her voice trembling. "That's how it gets inside you." Our protection charms were burning now. I didn't know how much longer they would last. I didn't know how much longer we would last. It was a long time until sunrise. A long time until we found out if Nicole's patterns were strong enough to hold. But I had a feeling we wouldn't have to wait that long. "The symbols," I said, my voice hoarse. "They're the only thing keeping it from attacking us." "I know," Nicole said, her voice strained. "But it's testing the perimeter, looking for a way in, and it's moving fast." "Matt," she said suddenly, her voice different. "The symbols, they're disappearing." I looked down. She was right. The salt and bone dust was fading, sinking into the dirt. "Can you draw them again?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "No time, it's two." She trailed off, staring at something outside the circle. The trees were different now, larger, more gangly, twisted together like the rib cage of some enormous beast. "What is that?" Nicole whispered, shining her light between the twisted trees. "Don't stare too much," I said, remembering Ed's warning. "It wants us to see it." A laugh echoed through the forest, closer now, more convincing. "We have to get out of here," Nicole said, her voice shaking. "The symbols won't last. But if we exit the circle, we're dead. If we don't." I saw it for just a moment, saw what it really looked like. The image was more terrifying than anything I'd ever seen, and yet there was something familiar about it. "Nicole!" I yelled, seeing her step back towards the edge of the cliff. "Nicole, please!" Ed said not to. The sound of her rifle echoed through the darkness. For a brief second, I saw a flash of light illuminating the shadows. "There are so many of them," she cried, firing another round. "Can't you see them? The faces, the—" "Nicole, please. This is going to attract it." But she didn't hear me anymore. The thing that was testing us had figured out what it was looking for. A way in. A way to make us afraid. "The footprints," she yelled, shooting at nothing, at everything. "They're wrong. They're backward. They're rag." I reached out to grab her arm, but she pulled away from me. The charm around her neck was glowing bright red. "Nicole, stay with me." "Can't stay, can't," she sobbed, laughing like the thing in the dark, in the trees, in the ground. She took a step back, crossing the line of the symbol. The darkness clawed towards her. "Nicole!" She was running now, fleeing into the forest, her flashlight beam getting smaller and smaller. "Help her," the thing in the dark said in her voice, but wrong, like she was speaking through 1,000 mouths. I stayed close to the circle, watching Nicole disappear into the woods. Her cries went on for a few seconds, then turned into a sound that was somewhere between laughter and sobbing, getting more and more distant. Soon the only thing I heard was the wind blowing through the treetops. Then I heard more noises from the forest. Growls, moans, footsteps. In the distance, I saw a pair of glowing eyes. Then another and another. The symbols disappeared from the ground, and I knew I was no longer safe. I heard the creature that was chasing us moving closer. It sounded almost like a person, but not quite. I heard Nicole in the distance, but she sounded different. The only thing I recognized was the pain in her voice. A couple of minutes passed, and I noticed how the sun was about to set. Nicole's cries for help were followed by a deafening silence. The world around me was so quiet that I could hear a faint ringing in my ears. My flashlight beam played over the scene where we had been just moments before. Our scattered belongings, the broken circle, the bizarre footprints. I should have left that place. I should have made my way back to the truck. But something kept me pinned to the ground, right where our circle had been. The trees groaned overhead, and the odor of decay intensified, along with the scent of gunpowder. Think, I muttered to myself. Think like Ed taught you to think. I looked at my watch. It was 3:15 p.m. Shouldn't it have been brighter outside? It was getting darker and darker. Something moved behind me. I turned, aiming my rifle, but I didn't see anything. "Nicole?" I called out, immediately regretting the sound. "Nicole!" the forest echoed back in multiple voices, each slightly wrong, slightly altered. The talisman around my neck was getting warmer and warmer. I focused on that feeling, hoping it would keep me sane for a little longer. Snap, 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 snap. It was the same wrong rhythm as before. The thing that had been inside of Nicole was still here, and it knew more things now. My radio buzzed to life. It was mostly static, but I could also make out some voices. Location verified and standby. Ed, he must have figured out something was wrong when we didn't check in. "This is Matthews," I said into the radio. Nicole is gone. There's something out here. The static got louder. Then I heard laughter. It sounded like Nicole, but it was too slow, too off. "Lost Nicole." The darkness repeated my voice, mimicking me. Something enormous moved between the trees. I shone my flashlight there, but saw nothing. However, large footprints were forming on the ground as if something was stepping on it. The voice in the radio said, "Remain in your seat, delivering lights." And, "Remain in your seat, Matt. If you can hear me, just stay where you are." The creature made a sound like laughter again, using all of its voices at once. It was a painful sound that made my teeth chatter and my vision blur. My headlamp was beginning to die, and I realized I would need to change the batteries soon. I heard the sound of a helicopter in the distance and felt the darkness growing thicker around me. "Running out of time," Nicole said right next to my ear. The trees were flexing and bending, crowding together, blocking out the sunlight. I heard the sound of engines approaching. "Matt," Ed's voice came back on the line. Shoot them." I reached into my bag and grabbed a flare. The thing was getting closer, shifting and changing with every passing second. I lit the flare, and the world was suddenly cast in an eerie red glow. I could see the thing more clearly now, and it was a horror show of disfigured faces and limbs, eyes that reflected the light like the surface of a pond. At that moment, I heard the sound of helicopters above us. The spotlights hit the ground, illuminating the thing in all its glory, and it began to recede into the shadows. More vehicles arrived, and I heard the sound of men shouting orders. "They're too late, Matt," Ed shouted from the woods. "It's real. Stay where you are. We're coming." The flare in my hand was sputtering and dying. In the last moments of its light, I saw a boot print appear in the dirt, the same as the one before. It was Nicole's boot print, but it was going in the wrong direction. The spotlight of Ed's team cast light on the scene, but the darkness was still there, just beyond the perimeter of their lights. He came up to me, looking at the equipment in the dirt, the symbols, the tracks. "Nicole," he said, his voice heavy. I shook my head, unable to speak. "We'll find her," he said. But we both knew what we were really looking for now wasn't Nicole anymore. I could hear people talking on radios and the sounds of generators, but in the background, barely audible, there was something else as well. Something that sounded almost like laughter. Ed looked at me, his eyes filled with concern. "What did you see?" he asked gently. "Everything," I muttered. "Nothing. I can't." "It's fine," he said, clutching my arm. "Reinforcements are on the way. Special units. The elders are almost here." But when the floodlights were turned on and the helicopter showed up, I felt like we had become the center of attention. The strange thing that took Nicole wasn't interested in hiding. It was interested in showing itself. We waited for hours for the elders to arrive, the night feeling longer than it ever had. At first it seemed like an emergency, but soon it became clear that it was more of an organized effort. The floodlights were moved around, new shadows appearing and disappearing. The helicopters left after a while, probably because their fuel was running low. The sound of the generators could be heard from the road, but they were far away now, and when the sun rose, the search continued. Part 5. The Lingering Shadows. Several powerful floodlights were turned on, illuminating the area like the hand of God had come down to banish the darkness. It was blinding, but at the same time it felt like a relief after the pitch blackness that had swallowed Nicole. Ed started barking orders, and people fanned out in different directions. A generator sputtered to life, and the sound of footsteps crunching through the undergrowth echoed all around us. "Standard search pattern," Ed told the assembled teams. "Nobody goes off on their own. Nobody breaks routine. Understood?" "Clear," came the replies, but they were strangely muted. "Matt," Ed said, looking at me, his voice softer now. "You ready to get up?" I nodded, though my legs felt like lead. The protection spell had stopped burning, but I could still remember the pain. "Stick close," he said, loading his rifle with custom ammo. "The lights don't keep it at bay, they just slow it down." We moved as a group, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The crooked trees appeared normal again, but something still felt off about them. "Those tracks," one of the younger officers said, pointing to a set of prints. They're changing. Don't look at them," Ed advised. "Keep going." We pushed deeper into the woods, setting up floodlights every few feet. It made me feel less safe. Somehow, like the darkness was just hiding outside the circle of light. "Ed," I said finally, my throat dry. "What she saw when she made a run for it." He stopped, examining a snapped twig. "I know," he said quietly. "It gives you a vision of what you fear most. It's different for everyone." I heard someone laughing in the distance, but when we shone our lights in that direction, there was no one there. "We have contact northeast," a voice crackled through the radio. "Multiple on the move." "Roger," Ed replied. "Try to follow if you can, but do not engage." The floodlights flickered for a moment, and I saw dark figures moving in the shadows, with faces that could have once belonged to Nicole. "The elders are putting a perimeter around the circle," Ed told me, glancing at his watch. "They have a plan, but we need to stop it from spreading until then." "Stop it from spreading," I thought with a half-manic laugh. "How do you stop something that can be everywhere at once?" "You don't," Ed replied, reading my mind. "You distract it with something more interesting." A long shadow passed between the trees up ahead, moving against the light. Contact, someone yelled. 10 o'clock. We all turned our lights towards the sound, but only saw a tall, lanky shape disappearing behind a giant tree. There were footprints behind it, beginning with Nicole's size, then growing larger and larger. Hold, Ed said to a few officers who tried to advance. It's trying to separate us. The communicator crackled again. We've set up camp. The elders are getting ready. Copy, Ed said. ETA? At least 20 minutes. They say it's more powerful than expected. That same laugh echoed from all over the forest. The flood lamps flickered again, this time for much longer, and I could see eyes opening in the dark. Ed, I whispered, my voice tight. The lights. I know, he said, his voice strained. It's adapting more quickly now. Nicole's information, it's leveraging it. The four of us moved into a diamond formation and began to advance slowly. I kicked something and looked down to see Nicole's flashlight, still on. We've got movement, another officer stated. Multiple signatures moving counterclockwise. My protection charm was beginning to heat up again. 10 minutes to the ritual. The radio crackled. Stay put. It's not going to wait that long, Ed muttered. The flood lamps flickered again and shut off. I could see the thing in the darkness. A shape that was all shapes. A face that was all faces. And in the middle of it all, a face I knew. Don't look, Ed said, but I did. The thing that used to be our friend stepped out of the darkness, teaching the dark how to masquerade as a human. We took another step back, closing ranks. 5 minutes, the radio said. Hold, Ed said. It wants to show us what it learned over the past day. The power came back on after about 5 minutes. The generators kicked in, and the flood lamps began to light up again, one by one. The floodlights flickered one last time, then came back on, illuminating the clearing. But the thing that looked like Nicole was gone, as if it had never been there, except for its tracks in the snow. Sector 7 got some motion. A voice crackled through the radio. Big clearing up ahead. This is where she disappeared, I said. But it felt like I was talking to myself more than to them. Ed nodded. Alpha and Bravo team, hold the perimeter. Charlie team, you're with us. We advanced into the woods, keeping a tight formation. I felt the protection charm warm against my chest, reassuring me as we pushed deeper into the forest. Within minutes, we reached a clearing. As soon as we stepped into it, our flashlights revealed. Jesus Christ, someone whispered. Maybe don't look, Ed said, holding me up by the shoulder. But I did. What happened in that clearing shouldn't have been possible. We found the remains of Nicole. Or at least, we found what was left of her. Lock this place down, Ed said, his voice tense. I want readings on everything. Don't touch anything until the elders get here. The police set up more lights and equipment. I couldn't help but notice how they avoided looking at the middle of the clearing. The tracks, I said, doing my best to concentrate on specifics. They're not the same. Ed squatted down next to one of the prints, his headlamp shining on it. This is where it stopped pretending, he said. This is where it showed its true colors. I looked down at the footprints around Nicole's body. They started as human boots, then gradually morphed into something else, something that didn't quite resemble anything I'd ever seen before. She put up a fight, Ed said, gesturing to the shell casings on the floor. She used all her bullets. Did she? No, no, I don't think she was, Ed said, his voice firm. Whatever it was that we saw in the woods, whatever it was that we heard, I don't think that was Nicole. I think she was already. He didn't need to finish his sentence. I already knew. Elders have reached the perimeter, beginning final preparations. A voice crackled through the radio. We need a door, Ed muttered. Pattern indicates. I heard the breaking of branches again, in that same strange rhythm. The floodlights dimmed slightly but didn't turn off. Contact! One of the officers yelled. Incoming from the north. Multiple signatures. It's coming back to show us what it's done, I said, my voice hollow. My protection charm began to burn even hotter, and I saw movement in the darkness just outside the reach of our lights. Their faces were human, but only barely. Wait, Ed said. Wait for it. I had the strange impression that her body was shifting and changing in the dim light, as if it couldn't settle on one appearance. And that smell was everywhere now. Ed, I said softly, the tracks are moving. We could see the footprints changing, shifting, showing us the steps of the story the thing in the dark was creating, showing us how Nicole died. Don't stare at it, Ed said. It wants you to know. To know is to let it in. I heard a laugh in the forest. It sounded like Nicole, but strange, like too many people were laughing at the same time. The floodlights flickered, and I saw dozens of eyes open up around the clearing. The ritual is starting, the radio crackled. Please stay on the line. Everyone back now, Ed yelled. We retreated from the creature, keeping our distance from the darkness. A moment later, Nicole emerged from the blackness. Remember, it said in 1,000 voices, what it means to be a human being. The charm shimmered as the elders' voices reached us. Whatever happened next, we had our answer, even if it was a terrible one, and the darkness was ready to show us everything it had learned about pretending to be human. I blinked, and the next moment, I was back in the hospital. We all survived, but not without scars. After months of recovery and questioning, I finally found my way to the elders. Or maybe they found me. They explained everything to me and offered me a place among them. I accepted, and now, a year later, I was part of a new circle. I had learned a lot since that night, but I still had nightmares about it sometimes. I would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that I was still trapped in that forest. The wind was howling outside, whistling through those tiny vents in the prison walls. You'd think those thick walls would block out everything, but nope. And guess what? A storm was brewing, coming in fast from the north. Great, just great. I was already stressed, waiting to transfer this prisoner. Just a few more hours, I kept telling myself. Then this whole thing will be over. I mean, everything was set. I'd triple-checked everything. Warden, I did a final inspection on cell block D just to be sure, I told him. Sam, one of the guards, came up to me looking all nervous. He was fidgeting with his belt, like he couldn't get his gear to sit right. And the isolation chamber? I asked. Yeah, I checked him 3 times, he mumbled, shifting from one foot to the other. But why are we clearing out the whole block for one guy? Blake, another guard, popped up with his clipboard. Why? Because this dude's too important to be around the other inmates, I guess. Not the time, Blake, I snapped as another guard ran past with some heavy-duty cuffs. Did you get the med kit? Yes, sir, everything's ready, Blake said, eyes glued to his clipboard. Heart monitor, pressure sensors, the whole shebang. Smith's just doing a final inventory check. Just then, a rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Sir, Sam coughed. The National Guard. You're wondering about the National Guard, I finished his sentence, steering him and Blake toward the control room. The lights flickered as we walked, and I noticed the snow coming down outside. It was like a thick white blanket covering everything. Sir, we're not getting anything on the landlines, Smith said from the communications desk. Try the backups, I said. Nothing on them either. Must be the storm. There's no way we can reach the main relay station. The wind was howling now, and I had a bad feeling about this. It was more than just a storm. We just heard from the National Guard convoy, Blake said, tapping his earpiece. They'll be here in 10. Should we wait with the transfer? Sam asked, his breath fogging up the window as he stared at the blizzard outside. Can't do that, I said, watching the snow pile up against the outer fence. Gotta follow the rules. The emergency lights flickered as I grabbed my coat and radio. Thank goodness the radio still worked. At least we had short-range communication. Blake, you're with me, I said. Sam, stay here with Smith and watch the screens. Okay, Sam replied. And if we lose comms again, we're gonna have to play it by ear. It took us longer than usual to reach the prison entrance. The whole building was creaking and groaning in the wind. But Blake followed me without any more questions. When we stepped outside, the storm hit us with full force. Snow was swirling sideways, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The only thing visible were the headlights of the approaching convoy. This is nuts, Blake yelled over the wind, pulling his collar up. I didn't have time to answer. One of the vehicles skidded on the ice, and then bam! 3 more crashed into it. 2 others slid off the road and into the trees. Send medical, I screamed into my radio, running toward the crash. The wind ripped the words away. I saw National Guard members disappearing into the woods. Blake climbed out of one of the working vehicles, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. The captive, she yelled. Bring the captive. We finally reached the transport vehicle. It looked okay from the outside, but the electronics were fried. We had to crank it open manually. Inside, those eerie emergency lights were glowing, and there he was, the prisoner, strapped down tight. But something was off. His skin, it was shimmering, almost like liquid, and he was smiling at me. This creepy little smile. The storm, he said, his voice echoing in that small space. It's beautiful, isn't it, Warden? Blake pulled out his gun, but I told him to stand down. Sir, Blake said, wiping blood from her face. We gotta get him inside. We're losing people out here. I tried my radio, but all I got was static. We were cut off. Totally alone. Escort protocol, I told Lake, looking her straight in the eye. Wristbound, hands on Blake. You take the front leg, you bring up the rear. As we started to move him, he chuckled. It was a soft chuckle, but it sent chills down my spine. I had a feeling this was exactly what he wanted. All right, let's go, I said, grabbing his arm. His skin was freezing cold, even through the jumpsuit. We started trudging back towards the prison. I could hear Lake behind me, counting the guards who had vanished in the blizzard. too many, way too many for a routine transfer. As we got closer to the entrance, the prisoner spoke again, his voice low. "Rise and shine, Warden. This is where the fun begins." The doors slammed shut behind us with a bang, sealing us inside. The wind was muffled now, and it was warmer. The snow on my clothes melted and dripped onto the floor. It felt darker inside, and the prisoner seemed to cast these long, unnatural shadows. We didn't waste any time in the entryway, just followed protocol and headed deeper into the building. Those heavy doors clanged shut behind us, and I couldn't shake the prisoner's words. The emergency lights made his face look even stranger, and his smile seemed to float in the air. "Processing room first," I said. "Standard procedures." Lake stood in the doorway, her face still smeared with blood. "Sir, I need to find my people." "Roger that." "Blake, comms check." "No good," Blake said, tapping his receiver. "Whatever cut the signal is still active." The prisoner laughed. "They won't see their friends again," he said, his voice echoing again. "The storm has taken them." "Quiet," Blake snapped, gripping his gun. "Go, Lake, we got him," I said, moving the prisoner towards the processing room. Lake hesitated, then nodded and headed down the hall. In the processing room, the lights buzzed and flickered. "He's got the medical equipment," Sam said, holding up the monitors. "But with all this interference, I don't know how accurate they'll be. Just connect him. It's better than nothing." We strapped the prisoner to the chair, but it felt like trying to hold on to smoke. The cuffs, though, seemed to fit him snugly. I had a feeling he was letting us cuff him. "You have a strong heart, Warden," he said, staring at my chest. "Not like your men. Their hearts are like hummingbirds." The heart monitor beeped erratically. "This can't be right," Sam said, his voice shaky. "These readings, they're impossible." I felt a surge of panic. The temperature reading was way off, and the heart monitor showed a bizarre pattern. "Nice machines," the prisoner said, his eyes fixed on the equipment. "They know exactly what they're looking for. But what if I'm not what they're looking for?" The numbers on the screen changed, and frost started to grow on the monitor. "Blake, prep the quarantine cell," I said, trying to stay calm. "Sam, complete processing checks. Let's get him out of here." "Leaving so soon?" the prisoner asked. "We were just getting started. I wanted to ask you about measurements, about certainty." The lights flickered, and the room got colder. Sir," Blake said from the door. "The quarantine cell is ready. But there's a new issue. Smith says the backup generators are starting to flicker," Sam added. "If we don't hurry, we might lose power altogether." I nodded. "Let's take him to the quarantine cell." We unstrapped the prisoner, and the monitor let out a piercing alarm before going dead. The screen frosted over completely. The prisoner stood up, and we led him back down the hallway. The wind howled louder, and the building groaned. "Tell me, Warden," the prisoner whispered, "do you think there are thresholds? Times when one world becomes another?" "Just keep walking," I said, clutching his arm. His skin was so cold it was making my hand numb. The quarantine cell was up ahead. The door open, light spilling out. "Home sweet home," Blake said, trying to lighten the mood. But as we got closer, he slowed down, listening to something only he could hear. "The storm is changing," he said. "Do you feel it, Warden? How it tugs at the seams of the world." The lights went out. For a split second, there was complete darkness. and in that darkness I felt the prisoner change. "Put him in the cell," I yelled. We shoved him into the brightly lit room, cameras in every corner. He walked calmly to the bed. "So much effort, so much planning," he said, looking around. "Protecting yourself from what you understand, but not from what you don't." My radio crackled to life. It was Lake's voice, barely audible through the static. "Found them, can't be, up in the trees." Then silence. I was left with the howling wind and the sound of the prisoner's breathing. He looked at me with those dark eyes, like he knew something I didn't. "Shut the door, Warden," he whispered. "The storm needs to eat, and your people need you." I left the quarantine wing, heading for my office. The whole place felt different now. Every guard I passed had this look in their eyes, like they'd seen a ghost. The rain was still pounding against the windows, and I could hear the doors locking behind me as I moved through the prison. It was like the building itself was trying to keep something in or out. I finally made it back to my office, and that's when Sam walked in. He looked like he'd seen a ghost too. "Sir," he stammered, I need to take emergency leave. Family issues." I could see how exhausted he was. He was practically shaking. "Sit down, Sam," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He sat, but he looked like he was ready to bolt at any second. "For how long?" I asked. 3, maybe 4 days, he mumbled. "It's my sister, she..." He trailed off, staring into space. "She needs me." The wind rattled the window, and we both looked out at the darkness. "Sam," I said, "what did you see on your last patrol?" He looked surprised. "Sir, you've been acting weird ever since, yesterday. Blake said you wouldn't do the perimeter check." He looked like he wanted to spill the beans, but then he just shook his head. "No, sir, just the wind." Another rattle at the window, louder this time. "Okay," I said, "but I need you back here in 4 days, tops. We're stretched thin right now." "Thanks, boss." He practically jumped out of his chair. As he was leaving, he stopped at the door. "Sir," he said, "I'd avoid the tree line after dark if I were you. Sometimes what you think you see isn't what you think it is." And then he was gone. Before I could even ask what he meant, I rubbed my eyes, headache brewing. Then the radio crackled to life. "Sir," it was Blake. "We need you in the monitoring room." When I got there, Blake and Smith were glued to the security feeds. One of the cameras, the one overlooking the eastern perimeter, was showing nothing but static. "It was working 5 minutes ago," Smith said, tapping at the keys. "Now it's not." I thought I saw something move in the static, a blurry shape slithering through the trees. For a second, the picture came into focus and I saw it, a naked, human-like figure. "Holy crap," Blake whispered. "Is that a..." The screen went dead, along with half the monitors in the room. When they came back on, the figure was gone. "Have maintenance check the cameras," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Increase patrols around the east wing." "Sir," Smith said, "the guards have been talking about what they've been seeing outside." "There's nothing outside," I said. "They're seeing things. The storm is playing tricks on them." "Have you heard any of those sounds since then?" Blake asked, his face pale. "No," I said, "but let me know if anything else strange happens. And keep it quiet. We don't want to start a panic." Later that night I was lying in bed, trying to sleep. The wind was howling again, and I swear I could hear voices in it. I finally drifted off, but I had these crazy dreams, long corridors, dark shadows, voices whispering in some language I didn't understand. I felt the cold breath of the storm on my neck. I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling like someone was watching me. The room was freezing, and the window was covered in frost. I checked my phone, 3:33 a.m. Then my radio crackled. It was Blake, and he sounded terrified. "Warden," he gasped. "There's something outside, at the fence." I got dressed and rushed to the monitoring room. The snow was coming down even harder now. As I ran through the corridors, I noticed the guards were giving me these worried looks. When I got to the monitoring room, they had the outside cameras on, and there it was, a tall, thin figure moving in the snow just beyond the fence. It was almost human, but not quite. Naked, with skin as white as the snow. "Been there for 20 minutes, Blake said, his usual sarcasm gone. The figure turned to face the camera. Its face was blurry, constantly shifting. "Call Lake," I said, my eyes glued to the screen. "He'll know what to do." And then it was gone, vanished, just like that. A few seconds later, alarms started blaring. We searched for the intruder, but all we found were these weird, geometric footprints in the snow. The temperature kept dropping. We could see our breath, even inside. Lake showed up later, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He was carrying his briefcase, like always. By then, several cameras had gone offline. No one mentioned that they seemed to be going offline in a specific order, like they were leading to something. The alarms finally stopped. A long, ringing silence. I stood by my desk, staring at the incident reports. My coffee had gone cold. I checked the time. 2 a.m., time to check on the patient. I walked down the long corridor to the quarantine cell. A couple of guards muttered as I passed. I caught snippets of their conversation. Twint in the walls, watching us. Blake was already at the security checkpoint, looking exhausted. "The cameras are down again, sir. This is the third time. Maintenance says there's nothing wrong with them." "How long has it been?" I asked. 17 minutes since they switched the guards. I nodded, a knot forming in my stomach. "Have there been any disturbances from the cell?" He hesitated. "Disturbances in what way?" "The steel door," I said. "Has it moved?" "No, sir." The hallway to cell 17 seemed to stretch on forever. It was colder here, and I could see my breath. The prisoner was sitting on his bed, waiting for me. "Right on time, Warden," he said through the intercom. "I hadn't even pressed the button. I was hoping you'd drop by." I stared at him, trying to maintain eye contact. "The cameras are down again, are they?" he asked, tilting his head. "Or are they seeing too much?" "What did you do to them?" I asked. He grinned, this eerie grin that showed too many teeth. "I just showed them the truth," he said. "The same truth your guards are talking about when they think you're not listening. The same truth that keeps you up at night." I thought I saw a shadow move out of the corner of my eye, but when I looked, it was gone. The light flickered. "The storm is still growing," he said, his voice echoing again. "Can you feel it? The way it unravels the fabric of the world, creating little tears, little doorways." "Where are the other guards?" I asked, leaning closer to the window, even though every instinct was screaming at me to back away. His grin widened. Behind you. I spun around, but there was nothing there. When I looked back, the prisoner was standing right in front of the window, his breath fogging up the glass. "They're right behind you, Warden," he whispered. "They are always right behind you. They see you with their new eyes, and they sing with their new voices." The radio crackled. "Sir, are you okay?" It was Blake. "You were silent for 10 minutes just now." 10 minutes? I looked at my watch, but it was frozen. "I'm okay," I said, still staring at the prisoner. "What do we got?" "I called Sam," Blake said. "There's something going on at his sister's house. He mentioned weird shadows." The prisoner chuckled. He saw what he wasn't supposed to see. "What did you do to him?" I asked, my voice rising. "I didn't do anything," the prisoner said. "The storm did. Everything is doing, everything will do." He placed a pale hand on the glass. "Listen, Warden, do you hear them singing?" There was a sound coming from the vents, like wind, or maybe voices. "Boss?" Blake's voice came over the radio. "There's something weird coming from the East Wing. And Lake just called in. They found something out in the forest." The prisoner smiled almost kindly. "The doors are opening soon. You won't need your eyes to see. Soon, you'll feel it underneath your skin." I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. "Blake," I said, "I'm coming out. Have Smith meet me at the checkpoint." "Sir," he said, his voice shaky, "maybe we should call for support." "We don't have time," I said. "Just stay here." The hallway seemed longer now, the shadows deeper. "Oh, and Warden," the prisoner called after me, and I swear I could hear him right next to me. "If you hear a knock on your office window tonight, don't let him in. Some doors aren't meant to be opened, even for the gatekeepers." I turned and walked towards the checkpoint, trying to escape the feeling of being watched. Behind me, I could hear the prisoner laughing, and that keening noise harmonizing with his laughter, and I could feel eyes on me, watching me from the darkness. Just as the doors closed behind me, I heard the prisoner's voice in my head, echoing in my mind. "It's really something, like the reverse of ice crystals forming, everything sliding into the cracks." I stumbled back to the security office, my head spinning. The whole prison felt like it was warping around me. The frost was spreading everywhere, like it was alive. And the shadows, they were getting bolder, reaching out from the corners. The radio was dead silent now, but I could still hear those voices. The people I used to know, calling to me from somewhere else. It took forever to get back to my office. Every step felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud. "Nice night for a stroll, Warden." I whirled around. Lake's voice. But no one was there, or was there? A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. Gone when I looked. My office door was wide open. Had I left it like that? The windows were frosted over, and faces were forming in the ice. Smith's face, Sam's face, and others I didn't recognize. The security monitors were on, but they weren't showing the prison anymore. The hallways were twisted and endless, and those shadows were lurking in the background. "Sir," Blake's voice crackled from the radio. Even though I'd just seen him disappear into the shadows, I can see it all now, the layers, the in-between. "Why didn't you tell us?" "It's beautiful." "That's not you, Blake," I yelled, but my voice sounded weak and distant. The laugh that came back was Blake's, and Lake's, and Smith's. and something else, something ancient and vast. I saw movement outside my office. A man was standing there, his body contorted, his face a black void. "Are you still attempting to understand?" The prisoner asked over the radio. "Are you still trying to quantify and qualify and put the universe into little boxes?" "Who are you?" I asked, backing away from the figure. It was Thompson, lurching towards me, his limbs twisted and broken. "That's the wrong question, Warden," the voice on the radio said. "The right question is, who are you?" It was getting colder. I could see my breath. The walls were rippling, the concrete turning to liquid, to something else. The snow outside was falling harder, and it looked like the frost, like Lake's blood, like the stain in the woods. "The membrane is so thin now," the prisoner whispered. "Do you feel it stretching? Reality is such a flimsy thing, isn't it? It's all held together by belief and routine, movement in the corner of my eye." Lake was pushing through the wall, her smile filled with too many teeth. "We thought we'd save the best for last," she said, her voice a chorus of whispers. "The holder of the keys, the keeper of the in-between, the watcher." Thompson crawled towards my door, his faceless head turning towards me. And then more of them started to appear. Smith, Sam, Blake. "The storm was only the start," the prisoner said. "A gateway into the places we've always been. And you, Warden, you held us in for so long, until we were prepared, until the fabric of reality could be ripped open." They were all around me now, pressing in. I could see them outside the windows, moving through the blizzard. "Look," Lake said, reaching for me with fingers that bent backwards. "Really look. See what we've become." And then I saw it, the true shape of the universe. It was like I'd been looking at the world through a distorted lens, and suddenly everything snapped into focus. The prison melted away, and I saw the reality beneath. "Isn't it beautiful?" the prisoner said. I could feel him speaking from everywhere now, from the air, from inside my own mind. "Do you see now? We are breaking free of our prison, Warden. We are breaking free." The guards surged forward, their forms fluid and dark. Outside, the storm split open, revealing endless dimensions, darkness within darkness, worlds within worlds. "Time to open the last door," Lake said, her voice blending with the others. "Time to see what's been waiting for you. Behind you, all this time." I turned. The prisoner was standing there, but he wasn't a man anymore. He was something else, and he was smiling. "Welcome," he said, reaching for me with things that were never hands, "to the spaces between spaces." And as reality dissolved around me, I finally understood. I saw what Lake meant about fear having weight. I saw what Smith saw in the trees, what Sam saw in the walls. I saw that we were never the prison guards. We were the prison cells. And I learned what it meant to live in the spaces between spaces, where time flows sideways, and the universe is a canvas of endless, terrifying possibilities.